Hey guys, tonight we're not walking into a pyramid or flipping through a dusty book. We're stepping into a silence, one that's older than the desert, older than the hieroglyphs, older, maybe, than memory itself. You're standing in the middle of Egypt, but not the tourist kind. There's no sun-baked postcard, just the wind whispering over sand that hasn't moved in thousands of years. The stars are different here. Not because they shine brighter, though they do, but because you can feel them. They hang over you like quiet watchers, keeping an ancient promise, or waiting for you to remember something you've forgotten. You shift your weight on ground that's seen more than it ever tells. Under your feet, beyond layers of broken pottery and long sleeping bones, lie chambers no one's entered. Not because they're locked, but because no one knows they're there. You'll notice Egypt doesn't shout, it hints. A slanted stone, a carving half-worn, a name chiseled and then erased. If you came here looking for clear answers, you might be in trouble. This place doesn't give up its secrets easily, and you probably won't survive this mystery in the way you expect to. Not because it's dangerous, but because the Egypt you thought you knew is about to vanish. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away from Texas, or Toronto, or Tel Aviv, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are dreaming from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You run your hand along a wall so old, it barely remembers its own purpose. The stone is smooth, but cool, almost indifferent to your curiosity. You take a few steps, and already the silence is louder than any tour guide's script. In Egypt, the mystery doesn't knock, it opens its own door. It starts with the obvious pyramids. Everyone knows them. They're the intro paragraph of every history textbook. But tonight, you're not going to hear about how they were built. You're going to feel why they still exist. Why, after empires burned and rivers dried, and the language itself changed into something new, the pyramids remained. You've seen pictures, you've read headlines, but no camera can show you what it feels like to walk beneath those stones at night. There's weight here, not just physical, a kind of gravity that isn't made of mass, but memory. Something still lingers in the air, call it spirit resonance, or just the echo of thousands of hands working with a purpose we've lost. You pass a block the size of a car, and it's fitted so tightly next to the next one that you can't slip a credit card between them. Not even a razor blade. People built this. With what? With who? That's the question Egypt keeps asking back. Maybe it was just ingenuity. Maybe they knew how to cut stone in a way we've forgotten. Or maybe, just maybe, they didn't do it alone. As you keep walking, the stars shift above you, and the desert begins to feel like a book you've opened but can't yet read. You don't know the language, but you recognize the emotion. A strange mix of awe and discomfort, like standing on a staircase that doesn't go anywhere, or opening a door to find another door, and another. That's what Egypt is, one giant metaphor in stone waiting for someone to decode it. But the more you dig, the more you realize you might be part of the code too. So you take another step, and the silence, it doesn't resist. It welcomes. Welcome to the mystery. You're not in a temple. Not yet. You're standing on the Giza plateau, and it feels like the edge of something. Something enormous, ancient, and silent, but not asleep. The stars are steady overhead, but your attention is pulled down inward into the stone, into the thing that rises behind you, like a fossilized mountain made by hands. The Great Pyramid. You've heard the facts, the height, the base, the tonnage. You know it was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. You know it's made of over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing tons, fitted without mortar. You know all that, and it doesn't matter, because right now, what matters is this. There's something inside that pyramid no one understands. A space, a chamber undiscovered until recently invisible from the outside and still unexplored. It's called the Big Void, and it was found not with shovels or cameras, but with subatomic particles. Muon tomography. Not a phrase you'd expect to hear in a story about ancient Egypt, but muons, cosmic particles that pass through matter, don't care about history. They rain down from space like silent little spies, and they showed researchers that something vast and empty lies above the Grand Gallery, a hidden cavity, longer than an airplane, in a structure that's supposed to be solid. You picture it. This immense pyramid that's outlived kingdoms, holding its breath for millennia, and tucked somewhere near its heart, a room no human has ever entered. No known doorway, no tunnel. Just presence. And that's the part that keeps archaeologists up at night. It's not the size, it's not even the secrecy. It's the purpose. Was it structural? A flaw? A clever engineering trick to relieve weight? Maybe. Engineers debate that papers are written theories tossed around like sand in the wind, but there's something else that gnaws at the edge of reason. What if it's not just a chamber? What if it's a container? You walk along the pyramid's base now, and the stone is cold and unbending beneath your fingers. The night wind slips past you, carrying just a hint of age. Above you, that massive bulk, millions of stones carefully placed as if by a mind not just brilliant, but obsessed. With alignment, with geometry, with something more than tomb building. You climb slowly. Not the actual pyramid, those days are long past, but through imagination, you're inside it now. In the descending passage where the air gets tight and ancient. Your shoulders brush the walls. The light dims. You picture yourself squeezing through a shaft that was never meant for people. Because that's another strange thing, so many of the pyramid's internal tunnels are unwalkable. Too narrow, too tight, angled in ways that make no human sense. And some of them point to stars. Real measurable alignments to Orion to Sirius. Stellar signposts carved in stone. You start to feel like this whole thing wasn't meant to be entered. Not by bodies anyway. And then you remember the void. Still there. Still untouched. Floating in the stone like a lung waiting to breathe. And something tickles the back of your mind. Why hasn't anyone gone in? Because Egypt doesn't allow it. Not yet. No drilling. No boring through limestone just to satisfy curiosity. You could call it respect, or fear, or bureaucracy. But the result is the same, it stays sealed. Which means we still don't know. Some whisper it's a hidden chamber. Others claim it's the final resting place of Khufu himself, hidden from thieves and time. And some say it was never for the dead at all. That it's a harmonic chamber, a resonator. You pause. The idea seems outlandish. Until you realize the pyramid itself hums. Not metaphorically, actually. Studies show that certain frequencies resonate inside the king's chamber in ways that feel engineered. As if the stone amplifies sound like a tuning fork for the gods. Or the stars. And if you've ever stood in a cave or beneath a dome and heard your own voice change, become more than voice, you know what that can do to the human spirit. What if the pyramid was meant to do that, but on a planetary scale? Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians were simply master builders or something more, guardians of a kind of knowledge that transcended their tools. The kind of knowledge that wouldn't survive on papyrus or scrolls, only in stone. And you're here now, inside that stone, if only in thought. The void is still waiting above you, silent still, and absolutely real. You don't know what's in there. Gold nothing. A slab of stone that hums when touched, or perhaps just air, compressed ancient air sealed in for 4,000 years. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the void is not a room. It's a question. And like all of Egypt's best questions, it answers you by not answering at all. You climb out slowly, the pyramid behind you, now a little less solid, a little more haunted. The wind feels colder, the stars a little further away, You look back, and for just a moment, it feels like the entire structure is watching you. Not maliciously, just patiently. It's been waiting this long. It can wait a little longer. The desert around you shifts, not in movement, but in meaning. You've left Giza behind not in miles, but in mind, and now you're walking toward a place that most maps don't even bother marking anymore. There's no gift shop here, no photo booth, just sand wind and a whisper from Herodotus. He called it the labyrinth, and he said it made the pyramids look like child's play. You pause trying to picture it. A grand hall with 12 courts, 6 facing north, 6 south, all enclosed by a single wall. A roof made entirely of carved stone more intricate than words could capture. Beneath it, a subterranean level with tombs and tunnels that went on for miles. It was vast, impossibly complex, and most of all, real. At least according to Herodotus, who claimed to have walked through it himself around 450 BCE. You squint at the sand before you. There's nothing there now. Just the ruins of Hawara, crumbled stone, a drained canal, and the occasional half-buried block that might have been a wall or a doorway, or nothing at all. But you feel it. In the air. In your skin. The labyrinth hasn't disappeared, it's hiding. And the mystery isn't why it vanished. It's why no one talks about it anymore. Because once upon a time, people believed it was the key to Egypt's forgotten knowledge. Historians still argue whether Herodotus was embellishing a tourist dazzled by heat stroke and high tales. But other ancient sources mention it too. Strabo, Diodorus, Pliny the Elder. They all spoke of this vast underground maze at Hawara. Some even suggested it held sacred texts, secret knowledge, perhaps even a catalogue of the entire Egyptian kingdom. Imagine that. A library of stone beneath the desert, untouched, unread, unseen. You wonder, could it still be there? In 2008, a team of Belgian researchers using ground-penetrating radar claimed to find evidence of large chambers buried beneath the ruins. Massive voids. Aligned, organized, and oddly symmetrical. They weren't allowed to excavate. Local authorities shut the investigation down, citing concerns. And just like that, the whispers of the labyrinth faded again. You kick at a small mound of sand, and it crumbles beneath your foot. For a second, you imagine falling into a hidden passage, sliding down a ramp, slick with ancient dust torches, flaring up in your imagination, the scent of old stone and ink rising around you. What would you find? Not gold, not jewels, but shelves. Walls and walls of carved stone, each one etched with knowledge. Star charts, medicinal formulas, histories that contradict our own. Whole civilizations catalogued and preserved, written not for fame or faith, but for permanence. And maybe that's why it was buried. Because permanence is dangerous. The thing about the labyrinth is this. It's not just a myth. It's an embarrassment. A structure too big to be ignored, yet somehow absent from nearly every mainstream history class. No reconstructions, no museum replicas, just scattered mentions and an empty ruin. You walk farther, your shoes crunching over flint shards. In the distance, a line of palm trees sways in the breeze, the only markers between you and the edge of memory. You kneel and press your hand to the ground. It's not hollow, but it doesn't feel solid either. Maybe the ground is just tired. Tired of holding secrets no one bothers to ask about anymore. There's a strange kind of comfort in the idea that something so massive could simply disappear. Like losing your house keys, except your house was 1,000 feet long and carved from limestone. It makes you realize how fragile history really is, how dependent we are on what gets recorded, translated, published, and what gets left in the dirt. You think about the Library of Alexandria, about how fire erased more than conquest ever could. And you wonder if the labyrinth was a library, then maybe Egypt didn't lose its secrets. Maybe it just buried them, and here you are, standing on top of them. The sun has long set. The stars are back now, winking softly. They don't care whether the labyrinth was real. But they know where it is. They always did. You imagine tracing the constellation lines from above, connecting dots until they form corridors and chambers like the cosmic blueprint for something humanity wasn't supposed to forget. You lean back and close your eyes. In the silence, you hear footsteps not yours. Thousands of them. Sandaled feet padding over cool stone. Voices echoing in languages no longer spoken. The shuffle of papyrus scrolls. The low hum of a chant or a prayer or a mnemonic device meant to hold a kingdom's worth of facts in the mind of a single initiate. It's not spooky, it's serene, because if the labyrinth still sleeps beneath you, then that means it was never truly lost. Just waiting. Patient like everything in Egypt. Time is not an enemy here. It's a companion. So you open your eyes. The stars are still winking. The palm trees still sway. And the sand beneath you hides more than footprints. It hides the echo of an entire civilization trying desperately to be remembered. You leave Hawara behind in the dark, and the silence travels with you. It's a different kind of quiet now, not absence, but tension. As if something is trying to speak, but hasn't figured out the language yet. You're heading toward Giza again. Not the plateau this time, not the famous view. You're moving towards something older, stranger, and perhaps more controversial than anything you've seen so far. The Sphinx. It greets you without greeting. Just a stare, blank, eternal, patient. You've seen photos, sure, but in person under the moonlight, it doesn't look like a monument. It looks like something left behind, not placed, but revealed. Like someone peeled back the desert and found it already there. The Sphinx doesn't belong to any timeline that makes sense. Officially, it's attributed to Pharaoh Khafre, builder of the second pyramid. That's the safe story, the one told on placards and narrated by guides with matching polo shirts. It fits the dynastic timeline it has supporting statues, and it makes things tidy. But tidy doesn't always mean true, because there's a scar running across the Sphinx's body, and it's not just erosion. It's a clue. A stubborn, inconvenient clue. And it's been causing headaches for archaeologists for decades. You walk up to the base and run your fingers along the limestone. It's pitted, rippled, carved not by hand, but by water. Long, sustained water erosion. The kind that doesn't happen in a desert. The kind that hasn't happened in Egypt for thousands of years. Some geologists argue that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body aren't wind-based, but hydraulic, meaning they were carved by rainfall, centuries of it, which would date the Sphinx back to a time when Egypt wasn't dry, when it was lush green, and very possibly uninhabited. That would mean the Sphinx is far older than the pyramids, older than recorded history, maybe older than Egypt itself. Historians still argue whether the Sphinx's erosion is evidence of deep antiquity or just bad weather. The mainstream view holds fast Khafre built it, let's move on. But others, especially those pesky geologists, aren't so sure. You crane your neck staring up at the Sphinx's weathered face. It looks mismatched, disproportionate, like the head was recarved at some point, altered from something else, something larger. And here's the weird part. It's not just speculation. The head is much smaller in scale than the body. If it was originally a lion symbol of the constellation Leo, it would make perfect sense. In fact, the Sphinx may have once gazed directly at the rising of Leo during the vernal equinox around 10,500 BCE. That date sound familiar? It should. It's the same period Graham Hancock and others linked to the mysterious Younger Dryas cataclysm, a sudden freeze and flood that may have wiped out an advanced prehistoric civilization. So maybe the Sphinx isn't just old, maybe it's prehistory. You step closer. There's something haunting about standing before a creature, half lion, half human, fully silent. You can almost hear it breathing. Not in a literal way, of course, but in that strange low hum that seems to follow every truly ancient site, like a frequency just outside your hearing range. What if it was watching the stars? What if the entire Sphinx enclosure was a celestial observatory? a fixed anchor point for tracking not days, but epochs. The idea isn't as wild as it sounds. Ancient Egypt wasn't just obsessed with the sky, they mapped it, obsessed over it. Embedded constellations into temples aligned their structures with solstices and equinoxes, carved star maps onto ceilings. They weren't just stargazers, they were timekeepers. You lean over the edge of the Sphinx enclosure, looking down into the pit that surrounds it. The walls are strange, deep channels, vertical weathering that looks out of place. Not wind erosion, not sand-blasted decay. Something wetter, something slower. You remember something else too when the Sphinx was first excavated. In modern times, it was buried up to its neck in sand, like it was sleeping, like it had been deliberately tucked away, head poking out like a warning or a question. Who buried it? When? And maybe more importantly, why? There are no clear answers, just theories. Maybe the sand crept in naturally over centuries of abandonment. Or maybe, just maybe, someone wanted the Sphinx hidden, preserved, protected from whatever was coming next. Because if the Sphinx is as old as the erosion suggests, then it survived something big. Climate collapse, mass migration, a reset, the kind of event that scrubs the surface of the earth clean. You stand up slowly, brushing sand from your hands. You're not just visiting a statue tonight. You're standing before a survivor. And survivors don't talk. They wait. The Sphinx doesn't offer explanations. It doesn't need to. Its silence is the message. A riddle without a question. A monument to the part of history we're not supposed to remember. And maybe that's what unnerves you most. Not that the Sphinx is mysterious, but that it remembers. It remembers rain that hasn't fallen for 12,000 years. It remembers stars in different positions, constellations slowly shifting across the sky. It remembers a time before deserts, before dynasties, before gods had names. You step back. The wind picks up, dragging a curtain of sand across the ground like a slow-moving tide, and for just a moment, the air feels heavier. Older. You feel like you've trespassed into something sacred or secret, and the Sphinx eyes worn blank by time just stares, not forward. Through you leave the Sphinx behind, though it never really leaves you. Even as you walk, its presence clings to the edges of your mind, like a shape in fog that refuses to vanish. But tonight's journey pulls you forward deep into a temple, far from the camera flashes and guided tours. A place almost no one gets to see, at least not fully. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera. To the casual visitor, Dendera is a marvel, pillars etched with divine imagery, walls steeped in stories of goddesses and kings, of healing and fertility. It feels bright compared to other temples, hopeful even, but the real mystery waits beneath it. You descend now, step by step, into the crypt. It's cramped, silent, and carved in a way that makes you duck. The air is stale, heavy with centuries. And on the wall, there it is. The light. Not a real one. A relief. A carved image. But it doesn't look like anything else in Egyptian iconography. It looks modern. A figure stands holding what appears to be a bulb, complete with a filament-like shape inside. A cable, maybe a vine, maybe a cord connects it to a box. Priests surround it, reverent. They call it the Dendera light, and no one agrees what it actually is. Mainstream Egyptologists say it's a symbolic image, that the bulb is a lotus flower, the snake inside it, a representation of life force, the cable, a stylized column, all very spiritual, all very metaphorical, and yet something about it nags at you, because it really looks like a light bulb. Historians still argue whether the Dendera image is just religious art or something more literal. A depiction of lost technology, maybe. The kind that shouldn't exist in a Bronze Age culture. The kind that, if it did exist, would rewrite every page of human development. You squint at the carving. The shape is oddly familiar, like something you might see in a vintage electrical diagram. And suddenly, you're not in a temple anymore, you're in a laboratory of stone. What if this wasn't myth, What if the ancient Egyptians had found a way to generate light, not by magic, not by fire, but by resonance magnetism or some other force we've yet to rediscover? You lean back, hand brushing against the cool sculpted wall. Could a society that built perfect alignments, moved 100-ton stones, and mapped the stars down to millimeters, really have needed torches? Or did they find another way? And if so, why don't we remember? There's no soot in many of the deepest tombs, no residue from flames, nothing to show how they illuminated the underground, unless they used something cleaner, quieter. You blink, adjusting to the dim torchlight in the crypt. Irony, maybe, or foreshadowing. Because light is not just about visibility, it's about knowledge, illumination. And you're starting to see a pattern. All these places, Giza, Hawara, Dendera, they're more than just stone and story. They're questions posed in architecture, waiting for the right frequency to unlock. You take a slow breath, and the scent of old air presses in. Down here, it feels like you're not supposed to understand. Not yet. You notice something else. The figures in the reliefs aren't acting out myths. They're performing rituals, yes, but with precision, with tools, with intention. And isn't that what makes the difference between superstition and science? Intention. Back above ground, the temple feels less magical and more mechanical. Like every carving, every hallway, every chamber was part of a larger system. Not just a shrine, but a circuit. A living humming structure made of resonance and stone. You walk past another wall, this one covered in astronomical diagrams. The famous Dendera zodiac. A map of stars carved into the ceiling with constellations depicted as animals, gods hybrids of both. It's beautiful and eerily accurate. Some say it shows knowledge the Egyptians shouldn't have had. Like axial precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's rotation, which takes 26,000 years to complete. Modern science only confirmed that in recent centuries. But Dendera, they carved it into ceilings 2,000 years ago. How did they know? Maybe the light in the crypt wasn't their greatest mystery. Maybe it was just one part of a much bigger understanding, one that spanned stars and stone frequencies and philosophy. A kind of physics that didn't separate the sacred from the scientific. You feel the weight of that realization settling in. We keep asking the same question: how did they do it? But maybe the better question is, why did they stop? Because if this was technology, it wasn't just lost, it was erased. Not by fire like at Alexandria, but by time, by forgetfulness, by design. You glance back at the temple as you leave. The stone glows under moonlight, still etched with equations no one calls equations, still humming with meanings half understood. And you realize something. Maybe that strange image in the crypt is a light bulb. Maybe it's not. But it was definitely meant to be seen. And now you have seen it. Which means the darkness has just a little less power than it did before. The road to Saqqara is quieter than Giza, quieter even than Dendera. You travel not just through distance, but through tone, away from tourist hubs and towards something darker, heavier. Saqqara is the kind of place that doesn't announce itself. It waits. By now you've noticed a pattern. Ancient Egypt doesn't always shout its secrets. Sometimes it just builds them, buries them, and assumes you'll never ask the right question. Tonight you're asking anyway. You're not here for the step pyramid or the famous tombs. You're here for something stranger, something buried deep beneath the sand inside a limestone tunnel, so smooth and regular it feels like a rail line. They call it the Serapeum. You step down into the earth, past carved walls and cool air, until you reach the darkness. You flick on a flashlight, or maybe just your imagination, and there they are. The boxes. Black, gigantic, impossibly smooth. Each one cut from a single block of granite weighing up to 80 tons, with matching granite lids that weigh an additional 30. There are 24 of them lined up in alcoves carved with unnerving precision. They look like tombs, but no one's quite sure what for. Officially, they were meant for sacred bulls, Apis bulls, animals worshipped as manifestations of Ptah and Osiris. The mummified remains of some bulls have indeed been found nearby, but not inside most of the boxes. Many were empty when first opened. No inscriptions, no bones, just emptiness, just silence. And yet each lid fits so tightly that even a whisper couldn't slip through. You run your hand along one of the boxes. The granite is flawless, mirror-like, untouched by time. And that's when the questions start to pile up faster than the explanations. How did they carve this? Granite isn't limestone. It's one of the hardest stones on Earth. Even with copper tools, the standard answer, it should have taken decades just to shape one box. And yet, here they are. Not one, not 5, 24, symmetrical, identical, as if machine-made. Historians still argue whether these boxes are proof of lost machining or just the result of patience and skill. But standing here among giants of polished black stone, patience alone starts to feel insufficient. Then there's the acoustics. Clap your hands, just once. The echo doesn't bounce, it rings, like a bell inside a cathedral. The whole chamber seems to vibrate, as though the granite itself is tuned to some forgotten note. You almost expect to feel a heartbeat coming from inside the stone. Not a metaphorical one, a literal thrum, like these boxes are asleep, or listening. Some researchers believe the boxes were designed for resonance. That sound or vibration was part of their function, not for bulls, but for energy, or consciousness, or something stranger. You take a step back. Look at the overall layout. Each chamber perfectly cut, each box precisely placed. There's no wasted space, no filler, just purpose. And that's what unnerves you, because you realize you don't know what that purpose was. People have theories. Oh, they have theories that the boxes were ancient energy containers, that they were designed to amplify the human mind, that they stored not objects, but frequencies. Some even believe they were part of an ancient technology that allowed communication with other realms, other times, or other beings entirely. You smile. It sounds wild. And yet, you're standing in front of an 80-ton mystery, cut by hands that left no trace of their tools. Even modern engineers admit replicating this today would be nearly impossible without diamond-tipped machinery and industrial cranes. And these were supposedly built over 3,000 years ago. You walk to another box. This one is sealed. Always has been. No one has ever opened it. And part of you doesn't want to. Because what if it's empty? What if it's not? The air grows still, not stale, still, like the entire chamber is holding its breath. And that's when you feel it, the weight of the impossible. Not just the boxes, but the implications. Because these aren't relics of a people fumbling through early civilization. They're not the clumsy leftovers of a culture still learning how to build. These boxes are statements, declarations, of knowledge, of precision, of intent. You start to think maybe ancient Egypt wasn't early at all. Maybe it was the after, a culture built on the remnants of something even older, something that passed down ideas not through writing, but through stone, through things that couldn't be burned or erased, only buried. You breathe in slowly. The granite smells like nothing, like the absence of time. It makes you feel very small. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these boxes weren't built for humans at all. Maybe they were built to remind humans of something, of someone, of a moment long ago when the world worked differently. As you turn to leave, your footsteps echo softly behind you. But the sound doesn't trail off. It resonates. It hums. The stone remembers your presence for just a moment longer. You climb back into the air above where the stars haven't moved. But you have. And now the desert feels even quieter, because you've just heard it speak. You emerge from the Serapeum like someone returning from a dream, not the soft kind with clouds and wishes, but the dense kind, the ones that stay in your bones long after you've woken up. The desert air feels thinner now, as if something inside the tunnels below had changed your ability to breathe. You look out across Saqqara, across the dry plateau that holds too many secrets to count, and one question rises louder than the rest. What were the pyramids for? Not how we've asked that one to death. And not when, though, even that's under constant revision. But why? Why build something so massive, so perfect, and so permanent? You turn slowly, eyes scanning the horizon, where the step pyramid of Djoser catches the moonlight like a fossilized staircase to nowhere. And then beyond it, the Great Pyramid of Giza, silent, immense, mathematical. It's often called a tomb. That's the official story. But you've seen enough by now to question that. Because here's the strange truth. There's not a single inscription inside the Great Pyramid. Not one hieroglyph. No images of the pharaoh. No decorations. No funerary texts. Just long sloped corridors and precision-cut stone. Nothing that screams eternal resting place. Only design. And not just any design. Intentional. Astounding. Take the geometry. The pyramid's base is almost perfectly square. Each side faces one of the cardinal directions: true north, true south, true east, true west, with astonishing accuracy. The discrepancy from true north, just 3/60th of a degree. And then there's the ratio of the perimeter to the height. Multiply it by 2, and you get a number remarkably close to the value of pi. Coincidence? Some say yes. Others aren't so sure. Historians still argue whether this precision was the result of sophisticated tools or just very careful surveying. But it's not just one measurement, it's dozens. Layer after layer of mathematical elegance built into a monument we're still trying to reverse engineer. And for what? You walk the perimeter in your mind, step by step, block by block. Imagine stacking 2.3 million stones, some weighing as much as 80 tons, with joints so tight you can't slip a razor blade between them. For a grave, you start to think about resonance again, about those strange acoustic properties in the king's chamber, the way sound travels and reverberates, how some researchers believe the pyramid acts like a harmonic resonator, capturing vibrational frequencies from the earth itself, a tuning fork made of stone. What if the pyramid was more than a tomb? What if it was a machine? Not in the way we think of machines today, not with gears and pistons, but a device designed to interact with natural forces, gravity, magnetism, acoustics. A structure built not to store bodies, but to generate something. Energy, consciousness, healing. You pause remembering Nikola Tesla, who once described the Earth as a conductor of acoustic resonance. He believed certain frequencies could transmit power wirelessly. He even designed his Wardenclyffe Tower to tap into that idea, a tower that was never completed. But the Great Pyramid was completed, thousands of years earlier. You wonder, was Tesla rediscovering something the ancients already knew? You peer up at the pyramid in your mind's eye, its apex missing the capstone long gone. Some say it was once gold-plated, others claim it held a crystal. And if it did, well, let's just say you've stepped fully into speculation now. The kind that feels more like remembering than imagining. You shake your head. It sounds crazy. But then again, so does dragging 80-ton stones across hundreds of miles with no wheels, no pulleys, and no cranes. You shift focus to the air shafts in the king's chamber. They're angled upward not for ventilation, but toward specific stars. One points to Orion's belt, another to Sirius. Stellar alignments frozen in stone from a people obsessed with the heavens. So maybe the pyramid wasn't just about death. Maybe it was about eternity. Not in a spiritual sense, but a technological one. You walk through the passageways now in your mind. The descending passage, the ascending passage, the Queen's chamber, the Grand Gallery, each space resonating with precise dimensions. The builders weren't guessing. They weren't improvising. They were executing something big. And then there's water. Yes, water. Beneath the pyramid lies a deep shaft, flooded, overlooked. But there's evidence the structure may have once interacted with groundwater, that it used hydraulic pressure to drive movement or energy through the chambers, a kind of fluid-based generator using the planet itself as a power source. You pause. That's not a burial chamber. That's engineering. And if the pyramid was a power plant of sorts, then it would explain a few things. The lack of soot in the tombs, the consistent stone resonance, the materials used like granite with high quartz content capable of piezoelectric effects under pressure. It would also explain why the design was so heavily copied but never quite duplicated. You think about the smaller pyramids, the bent pyramid, the red pyramid, the hundreds of step pyramids scattered across Egypt. They're shadows, prototypes, echoes of something greater. The Great Pyramid was the original, and like all originals, it defies replication. You step back into the cool night air. The moon is bright now, casting long shadows across the sand. The pyramid looms in your mind not as a monument to death, but as a beacon, a riddle written in stone. And suddenly the idea of it being a tomb feels small, too small, because the Great Pyramid doesn't feel like an end. It feels like a beginning. By now, you're no longer just walking through Egypt. You're drifting through layers of meaning stone to symbol geometry, to myth structure, to story. Everything connects. But not in the way textbooks would have you believe, not in a tidy timeline. Tonight, nothing's tidy. You're standing now in front of something small compared to pyramids, at least. A slab of stone, weathered, cracked, almost forgotten. It leans quietly in the Cairo Museum, away from the spotlight, passed over by thousands of visitors who don't realize what they're ignoring. It's called the inventory stela, and it's the kind of artifact that changes everything if you let it. You lean closer. The stela is inscribed in ancient Egyptian script dating back to around 670 BCE. But here's where it gets interesting. The text claims to be a copy of a much older document, and it mentions something that makes archaeologists very uncomfortable. It refers to the Great Pyramid, but not as a recent structure, not even as the work of Khufu. No. The stela claims the pyramid was already ancient in Khufu's time, and that's not all. It also mentions Isis, mistress of the pyramid, and a temple dedicated to her that once stood nearby. A temple Khufu supposedly repaired, not built, as if the landscape was already sacred, already ancient, already shaped by hands long forgotten. You squint at the hieroglyphs. They don't shout, they whisper. And what they whisper is this: maybe the Great Pyramid wasn't Khufu's triumph. Maybe it was his inheritance. Historians still argue whether the inventory stela is a forgery, an anachronism, a misunderstanding of religious symbolism. The official narrative dismisses it as late-period propaganda, trying to link new rulers to the ancient glories of the past. But you've been in Egypt long enough now to recognize a pattern. Whenever something doesn't fit, doesn't align with the approved story, it's dismissed, filed under symbolic later edition, or probably ceremonial. But what if it's not? What if this cracked slab is telling the truth? What if Khufu really did find the pyramid already standing and simply claimed it? It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. We know that many pharaohs repurposed monuments. Ramses II carved his name onto statues he didn't build. Hatshepsut erased her predecessors to reinforce her legitimacy. Egypt wasn't just a civilization, it was a story. And stories get rewritten. The stela goes on. It mentions a mysterious object, a sacred box, possibly a shrine, or a repository of knowledge. Some believe this might hint at the legendary Hall of Records, a hypothetical chamber said to hold the secrets of a lost civilization. A room that, if found, could upend everything we think we know about human history. And according to the stela, that box was buried near the Sphinx. You blink. The implication settles in slowly. What if the inventory stela is more than a footnote? What if it's a map? You begin to feel it again, that subtle tension, like you're brushing up against a secret that isn't yours to keep. The air in the museum seems thicker now, as though the stone itself has memory. not just of what was carved, but of what was intended. And if that's true, then maybe Egypt isn't just ancient. Maybe it's post-apocalyptic. That's the uncomfortable idea, isn't it? That something came before Egypt. A civilization more advanced, more precise, and more ephemeral. One that didn't build monuments for ego, but for function. And when it collapsed, whether by flood fire or forgetting Egypt emerged like a flower growing from the ashes. Beautiful, mystical, but not original. You step back from the stela. Other artifacts in the room catch your eye. Tools, bones, fragments of statues. They're displayed like relics of faith. But what if they're debris? What if we're looking at the leftovers of something we can't even name? You picture Khufu now, not as a mighty builder, but as a puzzled king standing before a pyramid already towering over the land, wondering what it meant. Maybe he didn't construct it. Maybe he consecrated it, claimed it, used it for his own narrative. You pause. That sounds familiar. It's what we still do today. We inherit stories, reframe them, build museums around them. We call it history. But much of it is interpretation, and interpretation, like architecture, is a kind of construction. The inventory. Stela doesn't give you answers, but it dares to suggest a different kind of question. Not who built the pyramids, but who were they built for? Maybe that's why the stele was tucked away. Because it breaks the illusion. Because it hints that Egypt, glorious as it is, might not be the beginning of civilization, but the echo of something even older. And maybe that echo is louder than we think. As you leave the museum, the streets of Cairo buzz with modern life. Horns, vendors, voices. But somewhere below your feet, beneath layers of stone and time, something ancient still hums. A message carved not in language, but in alignment, material vibration. The stela didn't create that message, but it might be the first clue that we're ready to receive it. You're back under the open sky again. The Nile far in the distance, stars pricking the heavens like forgotten coordinates. The sand crunches softly underfoot as you walk toward Aswan, a place where silence hangs not from absence, but from anticipation. Tonight, you're not here for a temple. You're here for something unfinished. At first glance, it looks like a mistake, a failed project, a curiosity half buried in the red granite bedrock. But the closer you get, the more you understand this isn't a failure. It's a question. The unfinished obelisk, lying in its quarry like a fossilized relic mid-birth. This single block of stone stretches over 137 feet in length and weighs, if completed, an estimated 1,200 tons. That's right, 1,200 tons. It would have been the largest obelisk in the world. But it cracked during excavation, and so it was abandoned, or preserved. You climb the slope and look down into the carved trench surrounding it. Smooth, precise, narrow. No room for error. And yet the surface of the trench walls is eerily perfect, as if whatever cut through this granite did so without resistance. Copper tools, the textbooks say. That's what the ancient Egyptians had at their disposal. Copper chisels and dolerite pounders. And yes, those methods can, in theory, shape granite. But not like this. Not with this precision, not on this scale. Historians still argue whether the obelisk was shaped by pounding or by some form of sawing. But if it was pounding, you'd expect jagged marks, chips, imperfections. Instead, what you see here are long, uniform scoops, parallel striations that look more like the byproduct of a high-speed grinder than a hammer. You crouch beside the trench and run your fingers along the wall. It's warm. It hums with age. And yet the cut is so clean, so narrow, that your fingers slide through without resistance. That's not erosion. That's engineering. And that's the problem. Because the unfinished obelisk, like so much else in Egypt, doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the tools. It doesn't fit the labor estimates. It doesn't even fit the narrative of what this obelisk was for. We're told these monuments were erected to honor gods, to pierce the heavens, to act as frozen sunbeams, representations of Ra's divine light on earth. And maybe they were. But how they were created is a question that just won't die. You imagine lifting this thing, just for a second. 1,200 tons. That's the weight of 3 fully loaded Boeing 747s. And yet, the Egyptians were supposedly preparing to move it, carve it, polish it, transport it, and stand it upright using sleds and ropes. Maybe they had a method we've lost, but maybe they had something else. What if the obelisk wasn't carved by hand? What if it was shaped by resonance? Sound vibration, high-frequency tools long forgotten or hidden. What if the pounding stones found in nearby pits were merely ceremonial leftovers, symbols of a technique we no longer understand? It's easy to scoff, until you stand here in the quarry staring at this vast unfinished colossus. You can feel it, not just its size, but its impossibility. It radiates something strange, not energy, not spirituality, but silence. A kind of paused story. And that crack, the one that led to the project being abandoned, feels symbolic, like a scar across time. A wound that says this far, but no further. Because whatever made this obelisk possible didn't last. Maybe the knowledge was lost, maybe it was taken, or maybe it required a kind of cooperation between people, between worlds, between ideas that no longer exists. You climb down now, stepping carefully between fragments of granite and history. At the base, you find tiny grooves etched into the stone, lines that serve no obvious purpose, as if someone was testing something, measuring vibration, calibrating frequency. Again, it's speculation. But sometimes speculation is the only tool we have left, because the evidence doesn't shout, it whispers. And what it whispers here is this: the unfinished obelisk was not a failure. It was a snapshot, a moment caught in stone, a bookmark from a chapter we haven't read yet. You sit on the edge of the trench for a while, letting the silence wrap around you. The city of Aswan murmurs in the distance, but down here it's just you, the stars, and a granite giant that never stood. You think of the obelisks that did make it, those still standing in Egypt, and those scattered across the world. Rome, Paris, London, New York. Pillars that left home centuries ago, carried by empires eager to possess the power of the past. But none of them match this one, because this one isn't just a monument. It's a message, a reminder that even the greatest projects can break. That knowledge, no matter how advanced, can vanish. That a single crack can freeze history mid-motion. And that sometimes what's unfinished teaches us more than what was completed. The stars flicker gently above you, as if agreeing. They've seen the rise and fall of things far older than Egypt, and they're in no rush to explain what they know. You place your palm against the granite one last time. It's cold now, but only on the surface. Beneath that, something warmer, not heat, not life, but memory. And maybe, just maybe, the day will come when we finish what was started here, not with tools, but with understanding. There's something uniquely haunting about a tomb that no one can find. It's not just the mystery of its location, it's the silence, the unanswered questions, the sense that someone somewhere meant to be remembered, and simply wasn't. Tonight, you're searching for one such absence. Imhotep. You've probably heard the name, especially if you've ever watched a certain Hollywood mummy movie. But the real Imhotep wasn't a monster. Far from it. He was a genius, a polymath, the Da Vinci of the ancient world 2,000 years before Da Vinci was even born. He was an architect, a physician, a priest, an astronomer, and most famously, the mastermind behind the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the earliest colossal stone building in Egypt, maybe even in the world. And yet, we've never found his tomb. You squint into the darkness as if expecting his burial chamber to rise out of the sand. But all you see is the vast plateau of Saqqara, already crawling with ancient tombs, yet somehow still incomplete. Historians still argue whether Imhotep's tomb is hidden beneath the step pyramid or buried somewhere in the desert untouched. Some believe it lies under the sands beneath layers of forgotten construction. Others suggest it was intentionally hidden sealed off not just physically, but ritually, to keep its secrets safe. Why would the tomb of Egypt's most brilliant mind vanish? That's the real question. You walk slowly imagining what kind of tomb Imhotep would have had. This was a man deified after his death, worshipped for centuries as a god of medicine and wisdom, not just remembered, venerated. And yet, his physical remains are missing. The deeper you go into this mystery, the more it begins to echo others. Think of the Phaistos disc, the Rohank Codex, the lost land of Punt. All things that existed provably and yet have no concrete conclusion, no satisfying end, no closure. You sit by a crumbling wall, the sandstone still warm from the day's sun. Was Imhotep's tomb looted, destroyed? Or does it lie perfectly preserved, filled with scrolls tools and mechanisms that would shatter our understanding of ancient knowledge? Imagine what such a tomb could contain. Not just treasures, not just art, but formulas, surgical instruments, astronomical charts so precise they rival the James Webb Telescope. Perhaps even documents that explain how the step pyramid was built, not just the blueprint, but the why. You picture a long, narrow corridor underground, lined with polished walls, covered in inscriptions not meant for the dead, but for the living. For us. A message across time. If only we could find it. There's an odd quietness about this idea that the key to unlocking so many of Egypt's enigmas could lie in a single chamber still hidden. It's poetic, and a little cruel, because Imhotep should be easy to find. He wasn't a minor official. He wasn't buried in some unmarked shaft. He was Egypt's Leonardo, a man whose reputation survived for millennia. And still, he's missing. That absence makes you think about what else is missing. How much of history has simply slipped through our fingers because the sand was too deep, or because we didn't ask the right questions, or worse, because we were too eager to believe the official answers. You shift your weight on the stone. The wind picks up, carrying with it a strange kind of melancholy. Not sadness exactly, something older, a longing. As if the land itself wants to be remembered properly. Some researchers have proposed ground-penetrating radar surveys beneath the step pyramid, hoping to identify hidden chambers. But progress is slow. Bureaucracy is thicker than bedrock sometimes. Others suggest we've already been near Imhotep's tomb, that we've walked right past it, that it lies beneath a structure mislabeled or misunderstood, that its secrets are waiting behind a sealed doorway, mistaken for a dead end. You tilt your head. That sounds familiar. So many of Egypt's mysteries aren't hidden, they're ignored, shelved, forgotten not by accident, but by design. Because Imhotep wasn't just a builder. He was a healer, a scientist, a symbol of everything Egypt once stood for: harmony between architecture, medicine, astronomy, and spirit. And maybe that's too much for the textbooks. Maybe it's easier to keep his story as a footnote. But tonight he's not a footnote. He's a presence. You rise slowly, dusting your hands. The desert around you stretches into infinity. Somewhere beneath this sand is a legacy the world was never meant to forget. A tomb not of death, but of brilliance. You imagine opening it, and suddenly the wind stills. Because in that chamber untouched for millennia, you might not just find bones. You might find answers. Answers to questions we're only now beginning to ask. And that's the scariest part, isn't it? Not that we might never find Imhotep's tomb, but that we might and not be ready for what's inside. There's a strange kind of silence that comes with forgotten queens. A quiet void where names should echo in halls of stone, but instead vanish like smoke in the wind. Tonight, you're following one such silence, a queen who ruled an empire, yet left behind no confirmed tomb, no known body, and barely even a trace of her reign's end. Her name was Nefertiti, and just saying it feels like a spell. Her face, graceful, composed, impossibly symmetrical, is one of the most recognizable in the world. Her bust, now housed in Berlin, draws millions of visitors each year. You've seen it. Everyone has. That half-lidded gaze, the elegant neck, the crown like a flame frozen in blue. It radiates power, poise, and a strange serenity. But her story, that's where things unravel. You walk the dim corridors of Amarna in your mind, a city built for her and her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten, in a single burst of visionary fervor. A place that was meant to redefine religion power and architecture itself. Together they worshipped the Aten, the disk of the sun, abandoning the old gods and building a new world. Briefly, gloriously, it seemed to work. Then, nothing. Amarna was abandoned. The new religion was erased. Akhenaten's name was chiseled out of monuments. Nefertiti disappeared from the historical record almost entirely. Not in a gradual fading, but in a vanishing. One day, she was queen. Then, silence. Historians still argue whether Nefertiti died suddenly or whether she assumed a new identity, perhaps even ruling Egypt alone as pharaoh under a different name. Some believe she became Smenkhkare, or even co-ruled with her son-in-law, the boy who would become King Tutankhamun. Others believe she was overthrown or buried quickly to avoid political backlash. And here's the strangest part: we don't know where her body is. You pause, letting that settle. One of the most powerful women in history, one of the most beloved, and her tomb remains a mystery. Or does it? Back in 2015, a radar scan of Tutankhamun's tomb revealed possible hidden chambers, walls that may conceal unopened rooms. Some believe Nefertiti lies just beyond those walls, in an extension of the tomb hastily sealed off when Tutankhamun died young. But the theory has stalled. Politics, preservation concerns, and institutional inertia have slowed progress. The doors remain closed, and Nefertiti remains missing. You glance toward the distant Valley of the Kings in your imagination. It yawns like a scar in the earth, an open wound filled with half-told stories. Most of Egypt's great pharaohs are buried here, but Nefertiti, whose name once shook temples, is not, or at least not officially. You can't help but wonder why the secrecy, why the erasure. Some say her religion was too radical. Others suggest her bloodline threatened later dynasties. Still others whisper that she held knowledge too dangerous, too sacred to survive the tide of political cleansing that came after Akhenaten's reign. You think of her bust again, the famous one. It was never meant to be seen publicly. It was a workshop model, unfinished on one side, a reference piece. And yet, it's become her only lasting image, the only confirmed piece of her that remains. No mummy, no grave goods, no definitive tomb, and that more than anything feels wrong. Because Nefertiti wasn't a passive figure. She wasn't a decoration beside her husband's throne. She was his equal. She appears in art performing pharaonic duties, smashing enemies, riding in chariots, making offerings. Some researchers believe she was the true architect of the Amarna period. That Akhenaten was the face, but Nefertiti was the mind. And if that's true, then what she knew was worth erasing or hiding. You imagine her final years. Did she die in exile, her ideas abandoned? Or did she live on in secret, a hidden power behind the throne? Maybe she was buried in a chamber designed to be forgotten, protected not by curses, but by bureaucratic obscurity. Or maybe she's still in Tut's tomb, just a few feet away, behind a wall no one has opened in 300 years. That's the thing about Egypt. Sometimes the difference between myth and evidence is just a locked door. You listen to the wind move through your thoughts. It doesn't offer answers, just more questions. And maybe that's how Nefertiti wanted it. Not to be remembered for her tomb, but for her enigma. To linger not in bone, but in breath. To be a presence, not a relic. And tonight, in this soft silence, she is. You're deep in the archive of myth now. Ancient scrolls may crumble, and temples may fall, but some books refuse to die, especially when they were never supposed to be read by ordinary people. Tonight, you're reaching for one of those forbidden tomes. Not a book bound in leather, but a legend wrapped in gold whispers and maybe even danger. It's called the Book of Thoth, and unlike most books, this one was never shelved. It was hidden. Thoth, in Egyptian mythology, was no ordinary deity. He was the god of writing wisdom, magic, and time. His ibis-headed figure graced tomb walls and temple ceilings, always watching, always recording. In legend, Thoth didn't just invent writing, he invented knowledge itself. And somewhere in that divine resume is said to be his book. The Book of Thoth wasn't ink and papyrus. It was power. They say it contained spells to speak with animals, formulas to move the heavens, words that open portals to the underworld, and most tantalizing of all secrets of the gods themselves. Whoever read it would become the most powerful magician in the world. You pause. It sounds like a fairy tale. But in Egypt, fairy tales tend to leave physical traces. One of the earliest references to the book comes from a tale written in the Ptolemaic period, Setna I. In this story, a prince named Setna seeks out the Book of Thoth, which is said to be buried with a sorcerer named Naneferkaptah. The story is strange winding and more horror story than legend. Setna retrieves the book, and everything goes wrong. Ghosts appear. Madness follows. The prince is punished. And the message is clear: this book was never meant for human eyes. But that hasn't stopped anyone from looking. Historians still argue whether the Book of Thoth ever existed as a literal object. Was it a scroll, a collection of texts, a metaphor for forbidden knowledge, or a surviving artifact from a pre-dynastic civilization, one whose understanding of the universe bordered on the divine? Some point to the Hermetica Greek-Egyptian philosophical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a figure scholars believe was a fusion of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth. These writings cover astronomy, alchemy, soul purification, and the architecture of the cosmos. Deep, dense material, way too advanced for the time in which it supposedly emerged. You wonder if the Hermetica are echoes, not the book itself, but fragments, driftwood from a sunken library. And that brings you inevitably to the Library of Alexandria. If ever there was a place where the Book of Thoth might have been copied, studied, or even locked away, it was there. A library with hundreds of thousands of texts, many of which no longer exist. Destroyed, lost, or stolen. A burning of knowledge we still haven't recovered from. Some believe the Book of Thoth was smuggled out before the flames took hold, hidden by priests or hoarded by secret societies. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the mystery schools. Names that pop up again and again when you dig deep enough. Others suggest it wasn't destroyed at all. It was buried. Not metaphorically, but literally. Somewhere in the sands inside a tomb behind a sealed chamber lies a text that has never been decoded. A series of symbols so powerful they were locked away, not because they were unreadable, but because they were too clear. You sit with that thought for a moment. Imagine a book not designed to teach, but to awaken. Something that, when read, doesn't just inform your mind, but changes it. Your perception shifts. The air around you seems stiller, as if something ancient is listening. You recall how Thoth was said to have created the world by naming things by speaking their true names into being. If that's true, then his book would contain the blueprint of reality itself. And perhaps, how to rewrite it. It's the kind of idea that makes historians uncomfortable. But tonight isn't about comfort. It's about curiosity, and maybe that's why the Book of Thoth hasn't been found. Because it isn't about locating a physical object. It's about being ready. Not prepared, not well read. Ready. There's a difference. You imagine holding such a book. Pages that shimmer not with ink, but intention. A text that doesn't just describe the universe, but interacts with it. You read a line and something changes. Not around you, within you. And you can never unread it. Maybe that's the real curse. Not death. Awareness. You let the thought hang in the night air like incense. Somewhere between the myth and the desert, between the ibis and the stars, the Book of Thoth waits. Maybe not on a shelf, but in a question, one that goes, What if you're not supposed to know? But you do. Now you do. If you walk long enough across Egypt's southern deserts, past the temples and past the tombs, you'll find a place that feels like it doesn't belong. A structure half buried and half remembered. Something older than its neighbors, heavier than the myths that try to explain it, and far more mysterious than the textbooks dare to admit. It's called the Osirian at Abydos. And it's not just a building, it's a contradiction. You step into the complex slowly. It lies behind the grand temple of Seti, tucked away as if deliberately obscured. Seti's temple is impressive in its own right. Ornate columns, carved hieroglyphs, scenes of pharaohs interacting with gods. A royal statement. But then there's the Osirian, set deep into the ground. Carved from megalithic blocks so massive, it makes the rest of Abydos look like a child's sandbox. And that's where the trouble begins. Because the Osirian doesn't look Egyptian, not in the way you expect. No rows of columns, no high-relief carvings, just enormous granite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fit together with astonishing precision. A style more reminiscent of Peru's Sacsayhuaman or Baalbek in Lebanon than anything else in the Nile Valley. Historians still argue whether Seti built the Osirian as a symbolic tomb for Osiris, the god of the afterlife, or whether he merely discovered it and constructed his own temple in its shadow. The official story says Seti built both. But you know better, because something's off. The Osirian sits lower than the temple of Seti, much lower, and the walls show no inscriptions, no cartouches, no royal declarations, no evidence of Seti's touch at all. The style is more ancient, more austere, more purposeful. And then there's the water. The floor of the Osirian is constantly flooded, filled with cool, ankle-deep water that never seems to fully dry. Some think it's due to the high water table. Others suspect it was intentional. A kind of ritual basin, a mirror for the stars, or perhaps a generator. Pause with that. Some fringe researchers believe the Osirian was part of a power system, that its layout materials and water flow echo the principles of ancient energy transmission. Granite is piezoelectric, meaning it can convert pressure into electricity. Combine that with water with potential underground currents with the resonance of the surrounding stone. You're not building a tomb. You're building a machine. That's not archaeology. That's physics. You walk along the edge of the platform. The pillars rise around you, smooth, silent, unyielding. Each one tells a different story, depending on how you ask. To mainstream historians, they're part of Seti's underground shrine. To others, they're remnants of something far older, something pre-dynastic, something pre-flood. You crouch beside a joint between two stones. No mortar, no wiggle room. Just a perfect fit so close that you can't slide a blade between them. That's not ornamental. That's intentional. You remember how similar stones appear in Machu Picchu and Pumapunku. Cultures separated by oceans, by continents, by time. And yet, they all speak the same architectural language. Massive, minimal, precise. It's not a style. It's a signature. And the Osirian bears that signature. You walk slowly around the inner chamber, tracing the stone with your fingers. Cold, immovable, but somehow aware. The kind of structure that doesn't just exist, it remembers. And if it remembers, then maybe it also warns. You think of the myths of Osiris, god of the underworld, the judge of souls, the dismembered king reborn. According to legend, Abydos was his final resting place, the place where his head was buried, a sacred center point for the entire civilization. And where did his story begin? In a time before Egypt, a time the ancients called Zep Tepi the first time, a mythical era when gods walked among men and knowledge was passed down, not evolved, when the Nile didn't flow north but east, when the stars were younger and the earth maybe wiser. Could the Osirian be a remnant of that time, an outpost from a forgotten world, a place not built by Egyptians but inherited? You linger a while longer sitting beside the flooded chamber. There's no sound here but the soft lapping of water against stone. It doesn't feel like a ruin. It feels like a pause, like the building is waiting for something. Maybe for understanding, maybe for recognition, or maybe just for time to catch up. Because when you build something that lasts for 10,000 years, you're not writing history. You're challenging the future. You rise slowly and glance back at the temple of Seti Day. It's beautiful, rich in stories, clear in purpose. But the Osirian, it's a riddle, wrapped in granite. And tonight you've heard it whisper. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd probably miss them entirely. Tucked away beneath the sands of Dashur, not far from the famous bent and red pyramids, lie a set of stone boxes, massive, dark, and utterly baffling. At first glance, they look like tombs. At second glance, maybe vaults. But by the third glance, the questions begin to outweigh the guesses. Tonight, you're descending into the Serapeum of Saqqara, where the so-called black boxes of Dashur reside. And they are unlike anything else in Egypt. You walk down a long, sloping tunnel. The air grows cool, damp, quiet. Each step takes you deeper beneath the earth, deeper into a place carved not just from rock, but from mystery. Eventually, you reach the chamber, and there it is, a granite box the size of a truck, smooth, precise, monolithic. These boxes, over 20 of them, line the chambers of the Serapeum, like coffins for gods. Each one weighs an estimated 70 tons. That's just the box. The lid, another 30 tons. They were carved from single blocks of solid granite and polished on the inside to near perfection. The kind of perfection that doesn't just speak of skill, it whispers of obsession. You reach out and touch one. The surface is smooth like glass, no tool marks, no irregularities, and the corners razor sharp, so sharp that light bends against them like they've been machined. But they weren't, at least not by any machine we know of. Historians still argue whether these boxes were sarcophagi for sacred Apis bulls, animals worshipped by the Egyptians as living embodiments of the god Ptah. The story goes that when an Apis bull died, it was buried here in one of these stone vaults to ensure its eternal rest. But the boxes tell a different story. There are no bulls inside now, no inscriptions on most of the boxes, no ornate carvings, just blank black stone, silent and unyielding. A few inscriptions appear on later boxes, but they seem hastily added, almost like afterthoughts. Graffiti compared to the precision of the structures themselves. You crouch down beside one and peer at the seams. You can't slide a razor blade between the lid and the base. That's not symbolic burial. That's engineering. And that's where the real questions begin. How did the ancient Egyptians over 3,000 years ago cut, transport, and position these behemoths with such accuracy? Conventional wisdom says they used copper chisels and stone hammers, ropes, sand ramps, maybe hundreds of workers pulling in perfect sync. But your eyes disagree, because this doesn't look like something built by labor. It looks like something manufactured. One theory suggests the granite was softened, chemically made pliable, like clay, and then shaped. Others believe ultrasonic tools were used to hollow out the interiors with such smooth curvature that modern engineers are left scratching their heads. Even stranger, some of these boxes resonate, like tuning forks. Tap them and they hum, not with a dull thud, but with a deep musical vibration, as if the stone was designed not just for strength, but for sound, for frequency, for something beyond burial. What if these boxes weren't sarcophagi at all? What if they were containers of energy, resonance chambers, batteries? It's a leap, sure, but consider this. Granite contains quartz and feldspar, both of which have piezoelectric properties. Add pressure, vibration, or electricity, and suddenly you're not dealing with tombs. You're dealing with technology. You step deeper into the chamber. The light is low. Your footsteps echo off the walls and vanish into the stillness. This place doesn't feel like a burial site. It feels like a vault, a repository, or a system. And maybe it was never meant for the dead. Maybe it was meant to store something. Information sound memory. Or perhaps something no longer recognizable to us. You place your palm on the box again. It's cold, but not lifeless. There's a density here, not just of matter, but of meaning. It feels like a sentence frozen in stone, its words just out of reach. Some believe these boxes were part of a much larger machine, one that spanned the Nile with sites like the Great Pyramid, the Osirian, and even Abu Ghraib acting as nodes in an energetic grid. A civilization not just building for gods, but with them. Of course not everyone agrees. Skeptics argue that the boxes were simply the product of religious zeal, that the precision is exaggerated, that we want mystery, and so we find it, that Occam's razor should be applied, and the simplest explanation is the truth. But tonight, standing in this chamber of silence, you sense otherwise, because simple things don't hum when you touch them. Simple things don't baffle engineers. And simple things don't survive 3,000 years in perfect geometric form, hidden beneath the sands waiting to be noticed. You close your eyes. Somewhere deep in the past, someone carved this chamber not to honor the dead, but to hold a secret. And they did it with such precision that the secret is still here, intact, untold, unbroken. Maybe the boxes weren't meant to be opened. Maybe they were meant to be understood. And maybe when that understanding returns, so too will the world that created them. Until then, they wait, black, silent, unyielding, just like the truth. You think you've seen mummies before, wrapped in linens, tucked neatly into coffins, displayed in glass cases with polite little museum placards. But tonight, that's not what you're looking at, not even close. Tonight, you're face to face with something different. A creature wrapped in the guise of ancient ritual, but carrying a shape that doesn't fit. Limbs too long, skulls too large, bones too alien. These aren't pharaohs or priests or even sacred animals. These are the strange mummified creatures of Egypt, and no one really knows what they are. You crouch in the half-light of an underground vault, brushing sand from a sealed box. Its inscriptions are faint, as if the writer was unsure what to label the thing inside. You lift the lid, or at least imagine it, and what you see doesn't match anything in the textbook. Elongated skull, huge eye sockets, hands with extra fingers, a body that seems too symmetrical, like it was grown to a blueprint we've never seen. Historians still argue whether these anomalous mummies are the result of ancient medical conditions, hydrocephalus genetic deformities, or mummified animals mistaken for human. But even those explanations only go so far. Some of the skulls discovered in sites like Saqqara and Kam Ambo appear to have no known analogues in any species, human or otherwise. They aren't shaped like human skulls deformed by binding or disease. They're too precise, too purposeful, as if they were born this way. One such skull unearthed in the early 20th century and quickly whisked into private collection. Limbo showed signs of having a cranial capacity far exceeding that of Homo sapiens, almost double. And yet, no signs of artificial deformation, no infant binding, just a different template altogether. You walk through the hypothetical archive of these cases, eyes squinting past the official paperwork. There's the Star Child skull, though technically discovered in Mexico, not Egypt. Still, it's often lumped into the same category, not because of geography, but because of implication. Implication that humans might not be the only intelligent bipeds walking these ancient corridors. Then there's the humanoid, found near the Karga oasis. Smaller than average, but with hands longer than its forearms. No official DNA result ever released. The body gone. The photos grainy. The analysis buried under layers of "we're still studying it." And the rumors don't end there. In the 1990s, whispers emerged of a sealed tomb near Abydos that contained what excavators described as non-human remains. The project was abruptly shut down. The team dispersed. No formal records were released. Coincidence? Maybe. But you've been walking Egypt long enough tonight to know that coincidences usually come with lockboxes and gag orders. You reach a chamber where feline mummies rest in neat rows. Sacred cats worshipped and mourned. But just beyond them, something less defined. An animal mummy. But of what? It has bird-like features, but no known species fits the bone structure. It has a tail, but not one consistent with any documented Egyptian fauna. And the wrapping is tight. Too tight. As if the embalmers were trying not just to preserve the body, but to contain it. You pause. Why would an embalmer need to contain something, unless that something didn't die naturally? Or maybe it wasn't supposed to be here. You sit beside one of the smaller sarcophagi. The smell of resin linen and old dust fills your nose. The air is heavy. Not oppressive, just ancient. You wonder how many other creatures like this were found and quietly removed from public record. It wouldn't take much. A change in the museum inventory, a closed-door storage room, a label that simply says miscellaneous remains. But even among the silence, there are a few surviving whispers. In 2012, a team near Luxor claimed to have unearthed a bundle unlike any they'd ever seen. The body was only about 3 feet long, with unusually long fingers and an almost reptilian cranial ridge. No human features, no readable inscriptions, just a glyph near the wrapping that loosely translated to Watcher of the Night Sky. The mummy was reportedly taken to Cairo and never heard from again. Watcher of the Night Sky. That doesn't sound like a house pet. It sounds like a visitor. Now maybe all of these stories are exaggerations. Maybe the photos are doctored. Maybe confirmation bias is playing tricks on the hopeful minds of fringe theorists. Or maybe they're glimpses into the parts of ancient Egypt that no one wants to explain. Not because they're scary, but because they don't fit, and what doesn't fit gets filed away. But tonight you're not filing anything. You're observing, not judging, letting the unease sit beside the curiosity. Because even if every strange mummy were simply a human with a condition, or an animal wrapped unusually, the pattern remains. Why do so many of these anomalies vanish? Why do their studies stall? Why do their remains end up in storage or worse, private collections with zero access? You stare at the last box in the chamber. Its lid is still on. No one's touched it in decades. Maybe it's empty. Or maybe it holds a puzzle piece from a much bigger picture, one that doesn't just redraw the history of Egypt, but the history of life on this planet. You stand up slowly. The flickering torchlight catches the edge of a linen wrap. It shivers slightly in the still air, not from movement, but from implication. Something was here. Something we weren't meant to name. Something that didn't just die, but was hidden. And tonight you didn't just find a mummy. You found a question, one that no sarcophagus can keep buried forever. You can almost smell the sea breeze. Its faint salt and spice, and something older. Still something that carries stories on its back, like a sailor does scars. You're not in the Nile Valley anymore. Tonight, your journey leads you far beyond the borders of dynastic Egypt into the hazy maritime realm of ancient trade-lost geography and half-remembered legend. Tonight, you sail toward the lost land of Punt. The Egyptians called it Ta-Necher, the land of the god, and that name alone should make your spine tingle. Because when the Egyptians gave a place divine status, it meant more than just reverence. It meant origin. They didn't believe civilization began in Egypt. They believed it came from somewhere else, and many believed that somewhere was Punt. You picture a scene painted in delicate ochres and faded lines inside Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a trading expedition. Ships sailing south down the Red Sea, exotic animals, giraffes, frankincense trees in baskets, dark-skinned rulers with noble profiles greeting Egyptian envoys as equals. It's all there, visually documented, official, celebrated, and yet, we have no idea where it was. Historians still argue whether Punt was located in modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, Yemen, or somewhere entirely submerged by rising seas. No ruins have been found, no definite coordinates, just records of trade expeditions and lavish imports, myrrh, gold, ebony, wild animals, and a resin so sacred it was burned in temples. You linger over the paintings of Queen Ati of Punt. She's portrayed with unusual proportions, rounded features, large frame, and a short stature. Egyptologists debate whether this was caricature medical condition or symbolic. But whatever the truth, her presence in the records is undeniable. She ruled. She welcomed emissaries. She gave gifts to Egypt. That's not myth. That's diplomacy. But then, silence. After the reign of Hatshepsut, references to Punt grow rarer and vaguer. It fades from maps, disappears from scrolls. The land of the gods becomes a ghost on the horizon. Some say Egypt lost contact. Others say Punt collapsed. Still others whisper that it never really existed on Earth in the first place, that it was a metaphysical origin, a spiritual homeland remembered in symbols rather than stone. A place like Eden or Atlantis. Not a city, but a state of consciousness. A source. You sit with that for a while. Because if Punt was real and all evidence points to trade diplomacy and repeated expeditions, then why can't we find it? Was it swallowed by the ocean? Was it erased by war? Or was it hidden? Some fringe theorists believe Punt may be submerged beneath the Red Sea, its ruins resting quietly under silt and coral. Others suggest it was an island now lost to sea level rise after the Younger Dryas, like so many other potential pre-dynastic sites. And then there's the strangest theory of all. That Punt wasn't a city-state or kingdom, but a gateway. A cultural node connecting Egypt to an even older civilization. One that carried knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and agriculture across sea routes long before any other known people were capable of open ocean navigation. It's tempting to wave that off as fantasy. But then, there are the boats. Ancient Egyptian ships were advanced, far more than you'd expect. Their designs, documented in temple reliefs, show rigging, steering mechanisms, and construction methods that rival later classical navies. They sailed the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, perhaps even beyond. And yet they always came back from Punt with more than cargo. They came back with ideas, new incense for religious ceremonies, foreign plants used in embalming, materials never before seen, shells, minerals, and powders with no local source. And here's the detail that slips by most casual observers. In the earliest records, the Egyptians didn't just want to trade with Punt, they wanted to return to it, as if it were home. That changes the equation. That means Punt wasn't just a foreign port, it was sacred. You peer into the waves of the Red Sea, the stars reflected in its depths. Somewhere beneath them might lie the docks where ancient sailors once anchored. The streets where dark-robed priests passed down herbs, minerals, and stories in a language we've never deciphered. What if they weren't Egyptian? What if the Egyptians were their students? A culture that planted seeds up and down the Nile before vanishing. Maybe through integration, maybe through cataclysm, maybe through design. The echoes are everywhere. In Egypt's obsession with rebirth, in their reverence for the sun, in their boats, their perfumes, their star calendars. And yet, no one can find Punt. That's not coincidence. That's mystery. You close your eyes and picture a ship sailing toward the unknown. No compass, just stars, wind in its sails, wood creaking beneath feet that have traveled this route before. They're not exploring, they're returning, and that's what makes Punt more than a puzzle. It's a pull, a whisper in the salt, a place that might never be found by force, only by invitation. Maybe it's still out there, waiting. You're not far from Saqqara anymore, but you're nowhere near comfort either. You followed a winding path down into one of Egypt's lesser-known tombs, not because it belonged to a pharaoh or high priest, but because what lies inside doesn't make sense. Tonight, you're standing in front of the tomb of the unknown animal, a cryptic chamber that holds more questions than bones. And that's saying something, because bones usually give us answers. This time they don't. The tomb was discovered, like many others, by accident, by excavation, by a team expecting the usual, some pottery, maybe a mummified dog or baboon, a few wall reliefs. What they found instead was a sarcophagus that didn't match any others. It wasn't particularly large or ornate, but its contents, they stopped everyone cold. Inside was a creature, or at least what remained of one. The remains were mummified with care, wrapped with intention, interred with reverence. This wasn't trash, it was treated like royalty. But the creature itself defied classification. It had 4 limbs, yes, but not of equal length. A tail longer than a monkey's, but segmented like an insect's. Its skull was elongated with ridges that didn't match any known mammalian pattern. No external ears. A jaw structure inconsistent with reptiles or mammals. No one could tell what it was. At first, they assumed it was a composite, maybe a ceremonial blend of animals sewn together as a ritual object. But further imaging suggested otherwise. The bones were connected, natural, no stitching, no joints out of place. It wasn't a Frankenstein monster. It was something real. Historians still argue whether the creature was a genetic anomaly, a long-extinct species, or a complete hoax. But no one has been able to match its bone structure to anything else in the known animal kingdom. Not from Egypt. Not from anywhere. You walk around the empty sarcophagus, now its contents long since removed, stored away in Cairo or London, or some climate-controlled vault that never sees the light of day. But the space still holds its energy. That cold, humming feeling of being watched, not by something present, but by the memory of what was. A guardian, maybe, or a warning. Some fringe researchers point to ancient Egyptian carvings of strange composite creatures, gods with falcon heads, jackal bodies, or hybrid forms. Most are assumed to be symbolic, allegorical. But what if they were inspired by something real? You run your hand along the side wall of the tomb. There's no clear writing, no cartouche, just faint symbols almost like a script that was half written, then abandoned, or covered, or maybe erased. You lean in closer. One of the symbols resembles a spiral. Another looks like a tree, but not the kind that grows. More like one that branches inward, a diagram perhaps, or a map. Could this be a lineage, a taxonomy, a visual code not just of worship, but of origin? You remember how the ancient Egyptians believed in sacred animals, beasts chosen as earthly vessels for divine essence. But they also believed in creatures not meant for our world, ones who dwelled in the underworld or crossed between dimensions during certain celestial alignments. What if this tomb isn't a burial? What if it's a containment? You step back, the quiet closing in. Why would you build a tomb for a creature you didn't understand? Why mummify it at all? Unless it meant something. Unless it wasn't just unusual. It was important. Some believe this creature was brought from somewhere else, traded from a far-off land, a gift from Punt, or a relic from Atlantis. Others suggest it was the result of early Egyptian experimentation, selective breeding, or even rudimentary genetic tampering using herbs, minerals, and unknown technologies. Sounds crazy, sure, until you remember that ancient Egyptian embalmers were chemical geniuses. They preserved bodies so well we can still read their skin, detect their last meals, trace their diseases. They mastered resins, natron humidity control without ever writing a modern chemistry textbook. If they applied that knowledge to something more ambitious, who's to say what was possible? And the tomb itself raises another problem. Its layout doesn't match other animal burials. It's geometrically unique, an asymmetrical chamber with angles that play strange tricks with sound. Whisper near one wall, and your voice travels to the far corner amplified. Acoustic engineers have studied similar effects at the Serapeum and in certain pyramids. Why would you need perfect acoustics in a tomb? Unless sound was part of the ritual, or worse, part of the seal. There's a theory out on the fringe that some ancient tombs weren't designed to preserve the dead. They were built to contain something alive, or at least something that once was. The unknown animal may be extinct now, or maybe it never lived in our world fully. Maybe it flickered in from somewhere else, like a glitch in nature's code. A visitor. A test. A leftover from a time before zoology, before taxonomy, before the rules hardened. You step back into the entrance passage, the torchlight behind you, casting long shadows against the ancient stone. Somewhere behind you, that empty sarcophagus waits. It isn't just a box. It's a question. Not what died here, but what lived. And as you walk away, the silence feels heavier. Not ominous, just unsolved. Because in a land where gods had animal heads and souls sailed in solar barges, finding a single unknown creature shouldn't be shocking. But it is. And maybe that's why no one talks about this tomb. Because it's not about proof. It's about possibility. And that more than anything is what keeps you walking deeper into the sands. You've stared at hieroglyphs before. Curved falcons, coiled cobras, ankhs, and solar discs. You've traced your finger across centuries of carved stone and thought, this is myth. This is poetry. But what happens when the carvings look right back? Tonight, you're stepping into the shadows of Egypt's sacred temples, not to admire their artistry, but to puzzle over the alien-like figures in temple reliefs that nobody wants to talk about. Not officially anyway. Let's begin at Dendera in the Temple of Hathor. On the surface, it's like many others, massive columns, painted ceilings, stories of gods and pharaohs etched into the walls. But there's one relief deep inside a carving so strange, it's become internet famous, museum ignored, and academically awkward. You've probably seen it. It shows what appears to be a giant light bulb. Yes, a bulb complete with a filament-shaped snake, a base like an electrical socket, and priests holding it aloft, while others seem to operate controls or stand back reverently. Below it lies a pillar-shaped object. Above it, wires or vines, depending on your level of skepticism. Egyptologists say it's symbolic, a representation of the lotus flower, giving birth to the serpent of creation, enclosed in a womb-like shape. Nothing technological, just metaphor. But your eyes disagree, because the lines are too precise. The components too structured. It doesn't feel metaphorical, it feels mechanical. And it's not alone. In the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, there's another set of glyphs partially eroded and half covered by later inscriptions. They appear to depict a helicopter, a submarine, a modern plane, even a kind of drone. You blink. The official line is that these shapes are the result of palimpsest carvings made atop older ones, creating coincidental overlaps that resemble modern vehicles. Historians still argue whether this is credible or convenient, because coincidence stops being reassuring when it happens too often. You walk past another series of reliefs, this time from Edfu. They depict beings with unusually large sloped heads, holding rods, wearing tight-fitting garments. They're often dismissed as stylized gods or priests in ceremonial attire, but they don't look ceremonial. They look anatomical, proportionally distinct from humans. Fringe theorists have suggested these figures might represent non-human visitors, entities that came from the stars literally. Many point to the ancient texts that refer to sky beings, those who descended in boats of fire, and shining ones who taught the mysteries. Even more compelling, some Egyptian myths describe the Neteru divine beings who ruled before the pharaohs. They came from the sky, ruled for thousands of years, and then returned. They weren't metaphorical. They had names, dynasties, histories, and sometimes shapes that don't fit the human mold. You stop in front of another carving, a tall, slim figure with a bulbous skull. Not animal-headed, not typical godly, just strange. The head curves upward, almost too perfectly round. The eyes are elongated. It holds something in its hands, maybe a staff, maybe something else. No label, no translation, just presence. You can almost hear the questions whispering through the sandstone. Were these just artistic exaggerations, or were they documentation? The answer changes everything. You think back to the Nazca lines in Peru, to cave paintings in Australia, to the Dogon tribe in Mali, cultures oceans apart, all depicting sky beings, star maps, and figures with oddly familiar helmets and suits. And now you're in Egypt, the cradle of civilization, the place where memory was written into stone. Would they really waste space carving stories that meant nothing? Or were they preserving encounters, maybe even warnings? It's hard to say. No alien autographs, no instruction manuals, just art. Vague, strange, and unsettling. But there's another layer to this mystery. These temples were built according to resonant geometry. Acoustics, sacred numbers, alignments with stars. They weren't random. They were coded. So, if the messages were important, wouldn't they have been hidden in plain sight, carved into the very bones of the building? You walk through the Hall of Columns again this time, listening not with your ears, but with your curiosity. Each carving feels like a breadcrumb, each figure a placeholder for something that once was, and maybe still is. And you realize the most important detail isn't what the carvings show. It's what they assume you already know. The Egyptians didn't need to explain who these figures were. They carved them like memories. That means these weren't myths. These were participants. You pause at a final relief. It shows a group of humans, small, reverent hands raised standing before a much taller figure with radiant lines emanating from its head. The translation reads simply, "Bringer of light." Not a god, not a king, just a presence. Could it have been a spiritual metaphor? Of course. But could it also have been literal? That's the uncomfortable part. Because when the past describes something as divine, glowing, and descending from the sky, we assume they meant it figuratively. But what if they didn't? What if they were just describing what they saw? The alien-like figures in Egypt's temple reliefs remain unclassified, unexplained, unwanted by mainstream academia. But they remain, carved into limestone, whispering across time. And tonight you didn't just observe them, you met them, and whether they were God's guides or something in between, they're still here, watching, waiting, wondering if we're finally ready to stop calling them symbols and start calling them history. There's a certain sound ancient tools make, stone tapping, stone metal scraping rock. But tonight, in the back of your mind, there's another kind of sound. A mechanical hum that doesn't quite belong in 2500 BCE. Because tonight, we're brushing the dust off an unsettling truth, the anomalous tools left behind in ancient Egypt, and how they don't seem to belong to the civilization that supposedly used them. You're standing in a workshop, not a modern one, mind you. There's no fluorescent lighting, no power cords snaking across the floor. Just open sunlight filtering through sandstone walls and fragments of granite and basalt scattered around you like someone was halfway through a project and never came back. You reach for a familiar sight, an unfinished alabaster vase. At first glance, it's beautiful, smooth, symmetrical, hollowed from a single block. But then, your fingers follow the interior wall and realize, there's no way this was done with a copper chisel. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used sand abrasion rotating drills or bow-powered lathes to carve and bore their stonework. Those methods can work, slowly, laboriously, in soft materials. But here's the twist. We found evidence that the ancients weren't always slow. Not when it came to cutting granite. Enter the core drill marks, cylindrical holes, bored into solid granite with spiral grooves that look like modern machining. The grooves are too deep, too uniform, as if a diamond-tipped tool was applied with mechanical pressure and continuous rotation. But according to traditional Egyptology, the ancients had no hardened steel, no diamond tools, no lathes, no rotary drills as we know them. So how'd they do it? Some claim it's a misinterpretation, that perhaps the grooves were accidental. Maybe a stick with sand twisted by hand for hours on end just happened to leave consistent spiral cuts into stone harder than modern kitchen countertops. But others, engineers, geologists, aren't so sure. They've replicated these marks using high-speed rotary drills, not by hand, not with copper, but with tools made millennia after the pyramids. You step deeper into the ruins of what used to be a tool site, probably near Abu Rawash or Aswan, where basalt and granite blocks were shaped before being hauled to their final destinations. There among the scattered debris you find the scoop marks, smooth concave cuts into massive stones that resemble the path of a mechanical excavator, each scoop nearly identical in depth and angle. You can almost hear the rhythm, dig, pull, repeat. But instead of metal teeth, they say it was stone pounding stone. You raise an eyebrow. There's no way. These aren't the chaotic scars of brute force. They're rhythmic, controlled, like someone was using a template. Now imagine what that would require if the tool was real. A massive claw-like machine, or perhaps even some kind of ultrasonic device that vibrated the stone apart at the molecular level. It's a theory, yes, but one supported by an uncomfortable amount of physical evidence, even in museums. Take the schist disc discovered at Saqqara in the tomb of Prince Sabu. It looks like a flywheel. 3 curved veins perfectly symmetrical, centered around a hub. It's made from a brittle stone that should shatter under pressure, yet it's shaped with precision. Theories abound. Some say it was a ritual object, a stand, a lamp. But no one's sure how it was made or why it resembles a component from an industrial machine. Its geometry doesn't belong in the toolkit of a Bronze Age civilization. You leave the museum and walk out into the quarries. At Aswan, there lies the unfinished obelisk, still attached to the bedrock, still bearing the chisel marks of whoever tried and failed to carve it free. That obelisk is over 1,000 tons, taller than a 10-story building. Cut with such precision that you can run your hand along the trench and feel flatness that rivals modern concrete panels. How? Some say labor and time, tens of thousands of workers, decades of effort. But the marks left behind tell a more intricate story, one where the tool used was not imprecise. It didn't chip the rock, it sheared it. And then there are the tube drills, hollow bits of granite and quartz left over from cores bored out of solid rock. Egyptologists wave these off as early drilling experiments, but engineers ask a harder question. How do you bore through granite with copper? Copper is soft, granite is hard. The math doesn't work, unless something else was used like extreme vibration, or plasma, or sound. Crazy, maybe. But when we assume the impossible, we stop seeing what's right in front of us. You stand back now looking over all the anomalies together. The impossible vases, the precision cuts, the spiral cores, the flywheel-like disc, the scoop marks, the obelisk trench. It starts to look less like coincidence and more like inheritance. What if the Egyptians didn't invent these tools? What if they inherited them? What if these tools came from a lost era, pre-dynastic, pre-cataclysm, prehistory as we know it? A time when knowledge moved differently, not in scrolls, but in machines, not in myth, but in application. The Egyptians may have copied the techniques without understanding the tools, a cargo cult of stonework, reverent, skilled, but always remembering more than creating. And that raises the most haunting possibility of all, that the golden age of Egyptian engineering wasn't their beginning, it was their aftermath. The tools left behind are the ghost prints of a forgotten science. And tonight you didn't just brush dust from an old vase. You brushed it from a lost blueprint, a technological language we no longer speak. But the stone remembers, and it's still trying to talk. The sun rises the same way every morning in Egypt, bold, unwavering, almost royal in its consistency. But somewhere in the records, there's a sunrise that never quite fits. A sunrise that brought with it something the historians still can't fully explain. Because tonight you're tracing the impossible timeline of the sudden rise of dynastic Egypt and how a civilization so advanced seemed to appear out of nowhere, fully formed as if it had inherited its greatness rather than built it from scratch. You're sitting in a shaded corner of a museum courtyard, now watching tourists file past statues of Khafra and Menkaure. They're marveling at the craftsmanship, the clean lines of the stone, the symmetry of the headdresses. But what none of them ask is the most important question. How did these people get this good, this fast? Dynastic Egypt begins officially around 3100 BCE when Upper and Lower Egypt were unified by the first pharaoh Narmer or Menes, depending on which source you believe. From that point forward, Egypt explodes into history: cities, temples, written language, astronomy, art, medicine, engineering. But here's the problem. There's no gradual build-up, no learning curve, no slow evolution from primitive huts to grand temples. It's as if someone flipped a switch. You wander through the pre-dynastic record and find it lacking. There are settlements, sure, pottery, burial jars, simple graves. But then bam, suddenly there are Mastaba's cosmetic palettes with high-level symbolism and the Narmer palette itself already showing artistic sophistication and political ideology. Historians still argue whether this leap was cultural fusion, the result of imported technologies, or something more profound. Because it's not just the structures, it's the systems. By the early dynastic period, Egyptians had already organized an agricultural economy, codified religious rituals, designed irrigation systems, and created a phonetic writing system, hieroglyphs, that remained virtually unchanged for over 3,000 years. That's not an early draft of civilization. That's a final manuscript. You step into a reconstructed tomb of one of the first dynasty nobles. Inside, you find gold leaf ivory game boards and cosmetic jars carved from hard stone. These aren't humble beginnings. These are signs of wealth, order, and inherited skill. The story gets stranger when you look at Sumer, another early civilization that also appears suddenly with cuneiform writing, mathematics, law codes, and advanced urban planning. Sumer and Egypt were contemporaries, but there's little evidence of direct interaction at first. Yet both exploded into history as if pushed by the same invisible hand. Could it be coincidence? Maybe. But maybe it was something deeper. You sit with the idea that Egypt didn't develop into greatness, it remembered it. What if the knowledge wasn't invented by Narmer's people, but rediscovered? Some point to Göbekli Tepe, dated to around 9600 BCE as a hint. That complex megalithic site predates agriculture, pottery, and cities, yet it shows monumental stonework and symbolic artistry. Almost as if there was a cycle before this one, a forgotten phase. What if dynastic Egypt was not the dawn but the afterglow? You walk now through the ruins of Abydos, where the Osirian lies buried beneath more modern structures. It's made from massive blocks of granite, some weighing over 100 tons, cut and placed with precision. No inscriptions, no official explanation. It doesn't match the surrounding architecture. It precedes it. Some Egyptologists place it in the reign of Seti III. Others admit it may be far older. If so, then the Osirian isn't just an outlier. It's a remnant, a fingerprint from a civilization long before dynastic kings wore the double crown. And then there's the calendar. Ancient Egypt's calendar system was shockingly accurate based on Sirius the dog star and its rising relative to the Nile's flooding. It counted 365 days and even recognized the discrepancy with the solar year adjusting through festival days. You think about what that means. Before the Bronze Age, before writing was widespread, they tracked a star system with mathematical precision. Who taught them? Who measured the sky for them? Even their mythology points backward. The Zep Tepi. The first time was the mythical Golden Age when gods walked the earth and laid the foundations of civilization. It wasn't a future hope, it was a memory. Thoth, the god of writing, Osiris, the bringer of agriculture, Isis, the mother of healing, all said to have taught humanity. The myths didn't say we created, they said we were given. You pause at a fragment of text from the Temple of Edfu, part of the so-called building texts. They describe a blueprint from the gods, sacred measurements, plans inherited and followed, instructions given not to a people starting from scratch, but one trying to rebuild. That theme comes up again and again. Egyptians weren't innovating. They were restoring, preserving, reenacting a cosmic order already handed down from the stars. It's easy to scoff at that, until you see the tools, the texts, the architecture, the art. Not crude beginnings, but elegant continuity. What if that's the real story of Egypt's sudden rise? Not that they came out of nowhere, but that they came from before. You stand now at the edge of the desert, where the oldest necropolises sleep beneath the sand. The wind shifts. Dust rolls across limestone. Somewhere beneath it all are secrets older than dynasties, older than stone. And you wonder, was there a civilization that didn't survive the flood, one whose survivors walked up the Nile, carrying what they could, language, memory, star lore, and the knowledge of how to build temples that would outlast empires? Dynastic Egypt may not be the start of history. It might be its echo. And tonight, you're not watching a civilization rise. You're watching one return. You've seen the hieroglyphs etched neatly on temple walls, sarcophagi, papyrus scrolls. They seem timeless. But what if I told you the story they tell is incomplete, not because it's wrong, but because it's missing a beginning? Tonight, we're delving into one of the greatest linguistic enigmas of ancient Egypt, the origin of hieroglyphs, and the eerie sense that this writing system appeared far too polished, far too perfect, far too early. You're standing before the famous Narmer palette, dated to around 3100 BCE. It's not just a beautiful artifact, it's a political announcement, a historical record, and a visual code of power. And it's fluent. Already, hieroglyphs in this earliest known form are complex. There are pictograms, phonetic signs, ideograms, and determinatives, all operating with a grammar that's already fully functional. There's no scribbled experimentation, no crude trial and error, no Rosetta Stone of its own. It simply is. That's not how writing usually evolves. Look at Mesopotamia's cuneiform. It starts with simple clay tokens and evolves slowly over centuries into a complete system. Or the Chinese script, with its progressive expansion from concrete to abstract. But Egyptian hieroglyphs, they show up fully formed, decorative, symbolic, multi-layered, as if someone had already invented writing somewhere else and Egypt just inherited the polished version. Historians still argue whether the writing system was developed internally or borrowed. Some say Mesopotamian influence might have catalyzed it. But the two systems are fundamentally different in structure, symbolism, and script. There's no evolutionary bridge between them. That's a gap. And where there's a gap, there's a mystery. You walk through the museum's writing wing now, where hundreds of glyphs line the walls, owls' eyes, zigzag lines, for water, ankhs, for life, scarabs, for transformation. Each symbol is beautiful. But they aren't just pictures. They're a code. Each glyph represents a sound, a word, or a concept. But more than that, hieroglyphs were believed to be living symbols. Carving them into stone wasn't just communication, it was invocation. The Egyptians called their writing medu neter, the words of the gods. Not metaphorically, literally. They believed writing had divine origin, that the god Thoth, scribe of the gods, gave language to mankind complete and perfect. Thoth didn't teach people to invent writing. He gave it. You pause at that. Because whether or not you believe in divine gifts, the idea of an imported knowledge system fits the pattern we've seen before. Sudden appearance, immediate complexity, and no sign of gradual evolution. Even the earliest examples from Abydos and Nakada show writing used for record-keeping theology and royal authority. That's not how scripts usually begin. Most start as tally marks used by farmers or merchants. Egypt skipped that. It jumped straight to eternity. And then there's the symbolic structure. Hieroglyphs weren't just practical. They were architectural. The arrangement of symbols mattered, direction placement, even how they faced each other. In other words, they were designed. Which raises the question, who did the designing? Some fringe researchers propose the possibility of a pre-cataclysmic civilization, one with a fully developed symbolic system that seeded multiple regions, each adapting the symbols into their own linguistic traditions. A proto-script lost in flood or fire, with Egypt preserving its most sacred version. They point to similar-looking symbols found in early Chinese, Mesoamerican, and even Neolithic European artifacts. Spirals, eyes crosses, and suns themes that emerge again and again, disconnected by geography, but unified by shape. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they all came from the same forgotten library. You move now toward the Temple of Edfu, where the so-called building texts record mythic blueprints passed down from the gods. These glyphs are different, more archaic, more symbolic. They describe a language of creation, a first speech that shaped reality. Sound dramatic? Sure. But consider this: ancient Egyptian priests used intonation and sound frequency to activate glyphs during rituals. They believed that speaking a symbol was as powerful as writing it. Words weren't just descriptors, they were forces. And hieroglyphs weren't just artistic, they were technology. You sit down on a temple bench running your eyes across the wall. Your gaze lands on an eye of Horus, a perfect semicircle. Fractions built into the segments. It's a mathematical symbol, a spiritual icon, and a piece of medical lore all at once. One glyph, multiple dimensions. This isn't primitive. It's modular intelligence, and it worked for over 3,000 years with virtually no major changes. Name one modern system that has lasted that long without overhaul. You won't, because systems evolve. But this one persisted. Why? Because it wasn't designed to evolve, it was designed to preserve. So maybe that's your answer. Hieroglyphs weren't born from trial and error. They were born from memory. Memory of a system so deeply ingrained in cosmic belief and social structure that changing it would be like changing gravity. And maybe that's why they finally stopped using it. Not because it failed, but because its keepers were gone. By the time of the Greco-Roman period, hieroglyphs were increasingly replaced by Demotic script and eventually by Greek and Coptic. The old ways were fading. The temples fell. The knowledge keepers disappeared. The last known hieroglyph was written in 394 CE in the Temple of Philae. Then silence. For over 400 years, no one knew what the glyphs meant, until Jean-François Champollion cracked the code in 1822 using the Rosetta Stone. Even then, it took years of study, debate, and obsession. And still, some symbols remain untranslated, because some things weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be felt. So tonight, as you drift into the strange world of divine grammar and pictorial spellcraft, ask yourself, what if hieroglyphs weren't a script? What if they were a download? A preserved transmission from a time when words didn't describe reality, they shaped it. And what if somewhere buried beneath the sand there's still a sentence waiting to be finished? You're deep in the Temple of Seti. Its sandstone corridors echoing with the soft footsteps of centuries. The air smells of limestone dust and old incense. Candles flicker in the corner, alcoves casting dancing shadows across carvings whose meaning was once sacred, then forgotten, then rediscovered, and now questioned. Because tonight, we peer into one of ancient Egypt's most debated enigmas, the helicopter carving in Abydos, and what it reveals about the long-lost layers of a temple that might have recorded more than just history. You stand beneath the architrave, the overhead beam that stretches across the temple ceiling. And there it is, a curious row of hieroglyphs, half hidden, worn by time, but still legible enough to start arguments. You squint. First, you see what looks like a helicopter. Blades on top. Body elongated. Tail clearly marked. A child could name it. Next to it, something that resembles a submarine. Then a shape like a fighter jet. And just for fun, something that could be interpreted as a hovercraft or drone. You blink again. These aren't ancient birds or boats. They don't match traditional Egyptian iconography. They look modern. But how could they? The carving is at least 3,000 years old. Mainstream Egyptologists quickly offer an explanation. This is an example of palimpsest. That is, one inscription was carved over another during a later restoration, creating a visual illusion, a merging of symbols into coincidental shapes. Makes sense on paper. But there's a problem. When you look closely, the lines don't seem random. They're clean, intentional. Some follow curvatures too precisely to be accidental overlaps. Historians still argue whether this is truly an illusion of restoration or evidence of something much more startling. You step back and try to picture the moment of creation. Imagine a stonemason perched high on scaffolding, carving these symbols with copper tools. Imagine their hands tracing curves they've seen before somehow. Could they be reproducing imagery passed down, not through time, but across epochs? Or could they be trying to remember something? This temple, after all, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a library, a school, a repository of sacred geometry, cosmic alignments, and metaphysical records. The Egyptians believed in Zep Tepi the first time, an era before recorded history, when gods ruled the earth and shaped civilization. What if this carving is a window into that forgotten chapter? Not a helicopter per se, but a symbol of flight, a memory of machines lost to sand and story. You walk through the adjacent chambers now, where other carvings line the walls: falcons, scarabs, serpents. These feel familiar, expected. But then tucked into a higher frieze, you spot symbols that don't seem to belong. A grid-like pattern too complex to be random. Concentric circles intersected by straight lines, almost like an airfield or circuitry. And here's where the story takes a deeper turn. In 1997, a set of fringe researchers proposed that many Egyptian temples, including Abydos, were built not just as places of worship, but as resonant machines. Structures designed to harness sound, light, and magnetic fields. It sounds wild until you walk through the Osirian just down the hill. There, acoustics behave strangely. A whisper at one end becomes a voice at the other. The massive granite blocks, some over 100 tons, aren't just for show. They resonate. They hum. Were these temples built to store information or to generate energy? You return to the carving. Let's say for a moment that it really was carved intentionally, not by mistake, not by accident, but by someone recording what they knew, or had heard, or dreamed, or remembered. What if these shapes were passed down from older epochs, the same way myths about flying ships, star beings, and sky gods appear in ancient India, Mesoamerica, and Mesopotamia? Egypt wasn't isolated. It was a crossroads. What if the helicopter isn't a message from our future, but a memory of someone else's past? You sit down, the stone still warm from the day's sun. Your fingers trace the glyphs one more time. The lines are worn. Arguments swirl around them like desert wind. And yet, they remain carved in a language of suggestion and silence. Even skeptics admit the carving is weird, too weird to ignore. And whether it was a coincidence of overcarving or a whisper from an older world, it holds power not because it's proof, but because it refuses to be dismissed. It's not alone either. Other temples hold other anomalies. In Edfu, you find symbols that resemble solar panels, beings absorbing radiance through squared patterns. In Karnak, depictions of towers emitting light. In Dendera, that strange bulb again, like a vacuum tube glowing with coiled energy. These are not just metaphors. They are diagrams. But of what? Devices, symbols, or both. Ancient Egypt didn't separate myth from mechanism. A staff was a circuit. A word was a tool. A temple was a battery. You remember something one old Egyptologist said in passing. The ancient Egyptians didn't build temples. They built experiences. So maybe that's what you're standing in right now. An experience designed to encode and preserve not just theology, but technology. Not in the modern sense, but in the cosmic sense. Information, blueprint, frequency, light. You walk out into the desert evening, the light fading over the cliff tops. Behind you, the carving waits, half erased, half remembered. You might call it a mistake, or a miracle, but either way, it demands a question. If the ancients saw helicopters, why don't we remember what they knew? And if they didn't, why does it feel like they should have? Because in the world of carved stone and forgotten timelines, some shapes won't stay silent. They hum, they hover, and they wait for someone, maybe you, to notice. You're walking now through a corridor not made of stone, but of silence, a different kind of temple. Not built with limestone blocks or topped with a golden capstone, but constructed from symbols, dreams, and knowledge passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. Because tonight, you're entering the invisible sanctuaries of the mystery schools of ancient Egypt and discovering that some of the greatest wisdom was never carved into walls, it was whispered. At first glance, Egypt seems like it told you everything. The temples are open, the hieroglyphs decoded, the statues photographed from every angle. But the more you study, the more you realize something's missing. The real teachings, the ones about the soul, the stars, the cycles of death and rebirth, they weren't written down. They were taught, initiated, preserved only for those willing to walk through more than doors, through states of mind. You enter this hidden tradition through Heliopolis, one of the oldest sacred cities in Egypt. Here stood the Grand Temple of the Sun, where priests studied astronomy, sacred geometry, and metaphysics. Not just rituals, but principles, laws of the cosmos. It's here you begin to sense that Egypt wasn't merely religious, it was esoteric. Historians still argue whether the mystery schools were real or just poetic embellishments layered onto priestly orders. But clues persist in symbols, in texts like the Emerald Tablet, and in later echoes from Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato, who claim to have studied in Egypt. What exactly did the Egyptians teach that was so powerful? Let's begin with the Ka and Ba, the components of the soul. To the uninitiated, Egyptian beliefs seem obsessed with death, mummification, tombs, funerary texts. But the mystery schools weren't about avoiding death, they were about mastering it. The Egyptians believed you were born with multiple layers of self. The Ka, your life force. The Ba, your personality or individuality. The Ak, your divine essence. And the Sahu, your spiritual body that transcends death. Initiates in the mystery schools were trained to reconnect with these layers consciously through ritual meditation and initiation. It wasn't religion, it was transformation. And nowhere was this clearer than in the temple architecture itself. You return now to the Temple of Luxor and look at it differently, not as a tourist, as a student. From aerial views, the temple layout mirrors the human body, the sanctum placed at the head, the pylons at the feet, as if walking through the temple was a metaphor for walking through yourself. And that's the heart of the mystery schools, know thyself. The body was the temple was the cosmos. And by aligning yourself with sacred geometry, vibration, and divine cycles, you could remember who you truly were. You pass into the House of Life, the Per Ankh, an ancient Egyptian center of learning found at Edfu and Abydos. This wasn't a library in the modern sense. It was a place where memory was encoded in ritual. The Egyptian priesthood had ranks: novices, practitioners, magicians, healers, astronomers. Each level granted deeper access not just to duties, but to truths. Imagine walking through a series of veils. At each step, your name changed. Your role changed. You learned the secret names of gods, not because they gave you power, but because they reminded you that language creates reality. And then there were the sound mysteries. You've likely heard about the resonant chambers beneath the pyramids. Some believe they were used to initiate sound-based healing. Others say they helped elevate consciousness through frequencies. The priests of Thoth used chanting not just to praise, but to change. Sound wasn't entertainment, it was alchemy. The human voice, they believed, could awaken DNA, though of course they didn't call it that. They called it the Jed, the spinal column, or tree of life. A living antenna between Earth and the stars. You think of the rituals held at the Temple of Philae, the processions on the Nile, the sacred hymns that only initiates were allowed to sing, and you begin to understand these weren't performances. They were activations. A mystery school didn't teach answers. It initiated experiences. You weren't told what the soul was, you were led to remember. And that brings us to the initiatory tombs. Imagine lying in total darkness for 3 days in the belly of a sarcophagus, not to die, but to shed your identity, to confront fear, to strip away the false layers of the self. When you emerged, you weren't the same. You were reborn. Plato spoke of this, as did Herodotus, as did Moses in the more mythic versions of his life. They say he was trained by the Egyptians, learned their secret names for God, their solar calendars, their hidden pathways to wisdom. What if Egypt wasn't just the land of pyramids? What if it was the original university, but one where your diploma was you, transformed? You wander now through the ruins of Hermopolis city of Thoth, where the ibis-headed god of wisdom watched over scribes and seekers. It was here that the Book of Thoth was said to be kept, a legendary tome containing all magical knowledge, including how to commune with gods and animals. Some say it was destroyed, others say it was hidden. But the mystery schools knew something modern systems have forgotten: some truths can't be read, they must be remembered. And so their teachings were encoded not in ink, but in symbol. The Eye of Horus, the Scarab, the Ankh, the Uraeus serpent, each one a lesson, each one a door. And you've walked through them all tonight. So the next time you look at Egypt, not just at its monuments, but at its silence, ask yourself, what isn't being said? What truths are too sacred for stone? The mystery schools left no curriculum, no textbooks, just initiation, transformation, and the deep resonant truth. You are more than body, more than mind. You are a temple of memory, walking through time, waiting to remember the first language, the one whispered before history began. And the mystery, it's still open, just like you. You've been walking through the desert for what feels like hours now, guided by starlight, pulled forward, not by footprints, but by alignment. Because somewhere up ahead, just barely rising above the horizon, is an idea older than kings. The connection between the pyramids and Orion's belt. Tonight, you're not just looking at stone structures. You're staring at a celestial map frozen in time, built not by astronomers, but by architects of the cosmos. And it begins at Giza. You've seen the photos: the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the slightly smaller one of Khafre, and the offset third pyramid of Menkaure. 3 structures, aligned diagonally. From the ground, they might seem like a construction quirk, maybe a product of uneven land or aesthetic choice. But from above, they mirror the stars, specifically the 3 belt stars of the Orion constellation, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. The resemblance isn't approximate, it's geometrically precise. And that's just the start. Historians still argue whether the alignment was intentional. The mainstream theory says it's a coincidence, or that the Egyptians, while brilliant, weren't mapping the stars with architectural precision. But let's look at the evidence. The Orion correlation theory, first proposed by Robert Bauval in the 1990s, suggests that the placement of the 3 pyramids directly mirrors the belt of Orion as it would have appeared in the night sky around 10,500 BCE. Yes, you heard that right. Not 2500 BCE, when the pyramids were supposedly built, but 8,000 years earlier, a date tied to the precession of the equinoxes. That's when Orion's belt would have lined up perfectly with the Giza pyramids on the horizon at the moment of the winter solstice. But that raises a giant question. How would the Egyptians, let alone any ancient civilization, know the position of stars from 10,000 years earlier? Precession is a slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. You can't see it in a single lifetime. You can't measure it without generational observations and extremely precise astronomical knowledge. Yet somehow the layout at Giza captures it. Coincidence or memory? You step into the Great Pyramid itself, and as you pass through the Grand Gallery, you notice something strange. The shafts cut into the stone narrow tunnels that exit into the sky are aimed not randomly, but at specific stars. One of them, Orion. The ancient Egyptians associated Orion with the god Osiris, lord of the afterlife, rebirth, and celestial order. They believed the soul of the pharaoh would ascend through the stars to join Osiris in the afterlife. But here's the twist: that wasn't just a spiritual idea. It was an astronomical journey. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a starship. Each shaft, each angle, each corridor possibly designed to guide the soul, not just up, but toward specific constellations. You sit now beside the Sphinx, that eternally silent guardian. It too faces the east, and on the vernal equinox, it greets the rising sun, a moment of perfect cosmic balance. But remember that date, 10500 BCE, because that's when the Sphinx would have directly faced the constellation Leo, its own symbolic mirror in the heavens. Some believe the erosion on the Sphinx's body is water-based, not wind, suggesting it was carved during a time when Egypt's climate was far wetter, long before the supposed timeline of dynastic Egypt. It's almost as if Giza is a stellar clock ticking backward through time, pointing not to its builders, but to their ancestors, or to something else entirely. You glance up at the night sky, Orion rising steadily now in the southern horizon. The belt stars gleam like a signature. They've been shining over Earth for millions of years, but only recently did we point back and say, hey, that's familiar. Cultures all over the world reference Orion. In Mexico, the Mayans aligned their temples with it. In Indonesia, the megaliths at Gunung Padang seem to point toward it. In South Africa, the ruins at Adam's calendar align to its rise. Coincidence again? Or was Orion a beacon? The Egyptians didn't just watch the stars. They believed the stars watched them. Life on Earth was a mirror of the sky, a concept they called as above, so below. This wasn't poetic fluff. It was a blueprint, a cosmic symmetry encoded in stone. And the pyramids, they weren't random monuments. They were nodes, fixed points of energy, geometry, and resonance, aligned not just with each other, but with the heavens. It's said that during solstice alignments, sunlight would pour down the king's chamber shaft in a narrow beam connecting the earth to the stars in a moment of sacred union. That wasn't superstition. That was celestial engineering. Even their mythology supports it. Osiris becomes Orion, Isis becomes Sirius. Their union brings forth Horus' symbol of divine kingship and solar renewal. The pyramids were more than tombs. They were transmitters, temples to remind us that we are not disconnected specks. In a cold cosmos, we are patterned reflections of it. So you lie back now on the cool stone outside the Great Pyramid. The stars are clear tonight. Orion is directly above you. You wonder what the builders thought when they looked up. Did they see gods? Did they see home? Did they remember something we've since forgotten? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The alignment is too perfect, the timing too precise, and the meaning too persistent across cultures to dismiss it as mere chance. The pyramids may not tell us where we came from, but they do something even more important. They remind us to look up, not just at the stars, but through them. The Cairo Museum isn't what you expect. There's no neon lighting, no touchscreens, no whispering artificial intelligence guiding your steps. Just old glass cabinets, wooden frames, and labels faded by time. It's a place where silence settles like dust, and secrets sit behind smeared glass waiting. Because tonight, you're not just wandering through a museum. You're exploring the Cairo Museum's hidden artifacts and the stories they almost didn't tell you. You step inside. The room smells of old paper stone and something metallic like forgotten blood. Statues tower overhead, some missing limbs, others missing names. A cracked diorite face watches you from behind the glass. Its eyes don't follow you exactly, but they don't look away either. You've heard the rumors that the Cairo Museum, beneath its official collections, holds a labyrinth of locked rooms, wooden crates, and miscellaneous finds that never made it to public view. Artifacts labeled unclassified. Items so strange, so out of context, they disrupt the neat story we've told about ancient Egypt. And you're here to look for them. Historians still argue whether these stories are true claims of basement vaults, of deliberately shelved relics of pieces that don't belong in any known dynastic timeline. But some of them, some have made it into view. Briefly, take the schist disc for example. Found in the tomb of Prince Sabu at Saqqara, this disc-shaped object made from extremely fragile metamorphic rock looks nothing like anything else from that period. It's symmetrical, it's machined, It has a central hub, curved fins, and a concavity that resembles a turbine blade. Even today, replicating it with such precision in such brittle material would be a nightmare. So, what was it? A flywheel, a ritual object, or the remnant of a technology we don't understand? Then there's the giant stone boxes of the Serapeum, some of which ended up documented in the museum archives. These 70-ton granite boxes, carved with laser-like precision, weren't meant for human burial. No inscriptions, no decoration, just size and silence. What were they storing or shielding? The deeper you wander into the museum, the more you feel it, this undercurrent of mystery. The sense that Egypt's past isn't just unknown, it's been edited. In a locked drawer somewhere, there's said to be a human tooth buried inside a sealed box, found inside the Great Pyramid, right where no body was supposed to be. Its DNA was never tested publicly. It was sent off, forgotten, or maybe remembered too well. You find the Dendera light drawing tucked into a dusty display at the edge of the museum's upper level. Most scholars say it's a mythological depiction, a lotus flower with a serpent inside held by a djed pillar. But to your modern eyes, it looks like a vacuum tube, a light bulb, a device. Even stranger, the original is carved in a crypt, one accessible only by ladder narrow stairway, and an invitation that most tourists will never receive. Why hide a creation myth in the dark? Unless the light it described wasn't metaphorical. Then, there's the mystery of the elongated skulls, fragments of which have turned up in museum storage rooms. Skulls with cranial volumes far larger than the average. Some attributed to head binding, others not so easily explained. You picture a curator decades ago opening a crate, examining the skull, and setting it quietly aside. Not because it wasn't fascinating, but because it didn't fit. Egyptology, like any discipline, has borders. And these artifacts, they cross them. You pass a cracked cabinet and notice a strange statue, a humanoid figure with almond eyes, long fingers, and an impossibly smooth head. No label, no record. Just a museum number and a worn tag. Is it a deity, an abstraction, or a memory of something other? Something not from here. Even the oldest maps in the museum's collection show the Nile splitting and reforming in ways that don't match the modern flow, suggesting either an ancient climate shift or older cartography than we imagine possible. And of course, there are the missing inventories. In 1901, a British archaeologist recorded finding a cache of scrolls inside a sealed compartment beneath the Sphinx's paw. Within weeks, the report was retracted. The scrolls were misplaced. Other expeditions claim to have found gold-plated tools in pre-dynastic tombs, objects with crystalline handles, blades that don't tarnish. Gone, vanished, or quietly filed away. Why? Perhaps because every civilization needs a neat beginning, a linear rise, a noble arc. But what if Egypt doesn't fit the arc? What if it's a circle, a fragment, a message? The Cairo Museum, for all its grandeur, isn't just a gallery of treasures. It's a gatekeeper, holding the keys to puzzles we aren't ready to solve, not because the truth is too dark, but because it's too big. You sit now in the atrium, the last rays of Cairo's sunset filtering through the high windows. You look around. Everything you see is categorized, but everything you feel isn't. Because the real treasures of Egypt might not be the golden masks or granite statues. They might be the anomalies, the misplaced, the things that whisper, you don't know the whole story. And that's why you came. Not for answers, but for the courage to ask better questions. So, as the museum closes and the guards walk their final rounds, you take one last look at the locked doors, the sealed crates, the dusty corners. They're waiting. Not for tourists, for rememberers. And maybe, just maybe that's you. You're outside again now, away from the stone walls and catalogued corridors beneath an open sky slowly shifting to night. But this isn't an ending. It's a beginning. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries of Egypt aren't hidden in tombs or buried beneath pyramids. Sometimes they lie in the strange alignment of temple sites, stretching like a silent sentence across the sands, written in stone and geometry. You take a breath and look at a map, not the modern kind, but one based on ancient sites. And you begin to notice something. Patterns, lines, directions that seem too precise, too consistent to be random. It starts with Abu Simbel way down in the south, near the border with modern Sudan. Its great seated statues of Ramses II stare eastward, exactly aligned, so that twice a year the sun pierces the temple's dark interior and illuminates the statues deep inside. Once on Ramses' birthday, once on his coronation. That's not art, that's engineering. You draw a line northward. It cuts through Kam Ambo, the dual temple dedicated to Sobek and Horus. Then Edfu, where the temple walls describe the blueprint of a long-lost primordial temple built by the gods before history began. Keep going, and you hit Luxor and Karnak, whose axes align with solar and stellar events. Karnak alone is so massive, it could fit several cathedrals inside its footprint, and its main axis is aligned to the rising midwinter sun. Still not impressed. Then draw a straight line from Abydos, home of the Osirian and some of the oldest temples in Egypt, to the Great Pyramid at Giza. It fits, almost perfectly. Historians still argue whether this ley line style alignment was intentional. Many write it off as coincidence. After all, ancient people weren't using GPS, right? But here's the thing. They didn't need GPS. They had the stars. The Nile flowed from south to north, but the sky flowed differently. Temples were built not just to mirror constellations, but to respond to them. Many aligned to Sirius, the star of Isis, whose heliacal rising marked the annual flood of the Nile, the rebirth of land and crop and time itself. And others, they're aligned to Orion. Again, that same celestial signature we saw in the pyramids. But these alignments aren't just architectural curiosities. They suggest a plan, a large-scale vision that spanned centuries, pharaohs, and empires. You're not looking at individual structures anymore. You're looking at a network. Imagine each temple not just as a building, but as a node in a vast terrestrial constellation connected by sacred geometry harmonics and knowledge passed through generations of priest architects. What were they transmitting? Energy, intention, memory. Take Dendera, for example. The Temple of Hathor is almost completely intact, and its columns are crowned with astronomical ceilings. It's been called a star map in stone. Its crypt holds depictions of the mysterious Dendera light, and its orientation aligned precisely to the axis of Sirius. Even stranger, when you map these temples across Egypt and draw lines between them, they don't just follow geographical logic. They form geometric patterns, equilateral triangles, golden ratios, Fibonacci spirals. Patterns not only beautiful, but encoded with meaning. In fact, when overlaid with the Earth's curvature, some researchers argue these alignments follow what's known as Great Circles paths along the planet's surface that connect sacred sites not only across Egypt, but across the world. Pyramids in Mexico, stone circles in Britain, temples in Cambodia, all connected geometrically. Coincidence or communication? You're beginning to see Egypt not as an isolated wonder, but as a part of a system, a planetary scale design meant to anchor consciousness, track celestial changes, or perhaps remember a past that's no longer visible. You think about the ancient Egyptian phrase Zep Tepi the first time. They spoke of it not as myth, but as history. A golden age when gods walked among men, when order emerged from chaos, when the world was set on its current course. Maybe these alignments are not just relics of that time. Maybe they are reminders, markers placed to withstand floodfire and forgetting, to say, look here, start here, remember. But we forgot, until now. You sit down beside the Temple of Esna, less visited, still sacred. A temple whose columns are covered in inscriptions that few tourists ever translate. And on the roof, a zodiac. a literal map of the heavens, constellations frozen in plaster, as if to say, above and below are not separate. They are reflections. Even the ruins whisper it. Look at Tel El Amarna, where Akhenaten once ruled. His whole city was built to face the sun, not symbolically, literally. The buildings, the axis, the horizon, all designed to worship, attend the sun disk. And then there's Siwa Oasis, far out in the western desert, home of the oracle temple of Amun, where Alexander the Great supposedly received confirmation that he was of divine descent. That temple is aligned too, not just with stars, but with energy. Magnetic anomalies have been measured there. Strange harmonics echo from its walls. Everywhere you go, Egypt aligns. To the stars, to the earth, to something else. So what does that mean? That the ancient Egyptians were just incredibly lucky. That their builders, working without electricity cranes or calculators, accidentally aligned thousands of tons of stone to cosmic events they couldn't possibly have tracked. Or that they knew something we don't. Because here's the thing, when modern engineers model these temples, they're stunned. The tolerances are too tight, the angles too clean, the placements too intentional. We would struggle to recreate this with our machines. And yet, they did it, without the machines. Or maybe just without our machines. Maybe they used resonance, sound, earth energy. Or maybe, just maybe, they inherited knowledge from an earlier time. A forgotten epoch that understood Earth's grid lines the way we understand street maps. Whatever the case, it leaves you with a feeling, not fear, not awe, but recognition, like something ancient has stirred inside you. And as you trace the lines on your map one last time, you realize you've been walking through a story written in geography, in geometry, and in light. A story that says, you are not lost, you are part of a pattern, and the earth remembers. The stars have turned again. You're nearing the end of your long walk through Egypt's silences, but there's one final door to open, one more thread to pull that might unravel everything. Because tonight, you're stepping into the realm of forgotten gods, those of pre-dynastic Egypt figures whose names were erased, merged, or buried beneath the theological system that would later define Egypt's golden age. And the deeper you look, the more the sand begins to whisper, there was something before the pharaohs. Let's begin at the beginning. The official story tells you that Egypt's first dynasty began around 3100 BCE with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the semi-mythical king Narmer. It's neat, clean, easy to put on a timeline, but the monuments, those massive blocks of granite limestone and mystery, suggest a longer arc. Because scattered across the land are temples and shrines far older than the official narrative allows. Structures like the Nabta Playa calendar, circle near the Sudanese border, date back to around 6000 BCE, possibly earlier. It's a stone circle aligned with solstices and star risings, older than Stonehenge, older than written language. And who built it? We don't know. No pharaoh's name, no carved stela, just stones, shadows, and silence. The ancient Egyptians themselves admitted they didn't invent everything. In their own temple inscriptions, they credited much of their knowledge, writing agriculture, astronomy, to the Neteru, the gods, and even earlier beings known as the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Historians still argue whether the Shemsu Hor were mythological or real. Were they priests, astronomers, survivors of some older culture, or just literary devices? But their name shows up again and again, especially in king lists like the Turin Canon and the Palermo Stone, where rulers with lifespans of hundreds or thousands of years are recorded before the first dynasties. And here's where the forgotten gods step in. Take Ptah, the creator deity of Memphis. In later dynastic religion, he's portrayed as a craftsman, god, a divine architect who spoke the world into being. But some scholars believe Ptah's roots stretch into pre-dynastic animism, when he may have been worshipped as a personification of the earth itself. Then there's Set, often painted as a villain in the Osiris myth. But in earlier traditions, he wasn't evil. He was chaos, yes, but also necessary balance. A desert deity, wild and ancient, born of a time when boundaries hadn't yet been drawn between dark and light. You begin to realize that many Egyptian gods underwent theological editing. They were merged, streamlined, sometimes tamed. Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, existed long before her official inscriptions. She may have once been a tribal fertility spirit. Bes, the dwarf god of protection and music, may have been brought in from Nubia, carrying memories of totemic ecstatic rituals lost to history. Even the mighty Hathor, goddess of the sky and love, likely evolved from Bat, a cow-faced fertility goddess from the early Nile Valley. But these gods weren't just symbols, they were presence. In the pre-dynastic era, religion wasn't carved in stone, it was experienced, lived, danced in ceremony, worn in masks, poured into libations under a sky with no names yet. And here's the most intriguing part. These earlier gods are less anthropomorphic, less human. Many have animal or hybrid features: falcons, crocodiles, lions, serpents. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a worldview. The pre-dynastic Egyptians didn't see themselves as separate from nature. They were nature. And so their gods reflected that fluid, wild, alive. Later dynasties, with their temples and priesthoods and calendarized festivals, would institutionalize this into theology. But in the beginning, it was direct experience. No intermediaries, just moonlight, drums, and breath. You now step into Hierakonpolis, a city buried beneath centuries, once a vibrant pre-dynastic center. Here they've found tombs older than the pyramids, pottery etched with mysterious patterns, a palette showing a giant falcon trampling a human, possibly one of the earliest depictions of Horus, long before his story was formalized. You can almost hear the chants that once echoed here. The god wasn't in the statue. The god was the air. And what about Anubis? He appears fully formed in the Old Kingdom, but his jackal-headed form suggests a much older origin, possibly tracing back to the semi-nomadic people who lived near desert cemeteries and believed the jackal was a guardian between worlds. Even the Benben stone, the sacred capstone said to represent the first land that rose from the primordial waters, has no clear origin in dynastic history. It just is, like a memory embedded in myth. You step back now and take in the whole pantheon. Ra, the sun god riding his celestial boat. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of knowledge. Ma'at with her feather of truth. All majestic, all deeply symbolic. But beneath them, behind them, there are shadows, half-names, whispers, spirits that predate the temples, the texts, even the writing itself. Some were likely local deities, worshipped in small tribes and villages, each with their own rituals, their own sacred trees or sacred hills. When unification happened, these gods were folded into the larger religious fabric. Some became aspects, some became demons, some disappeared, but others remained quietly pulsing beneath the surface of mainstream worship. You think now of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and healing. In some stories, she was nearly erased after almost destroying humanity. The priests had to trick her with wine. But other versions, they say she was never tamed. She just waited. Maybe she still is. The forgotten gods of Egypt aren't gone. They're just disguised, hiding behind the names we know, waiting for memory, waiting for a dreamer. Maybe that's why you've come all this way. Not to photograph ruins, not to decode glyphs, but to listen to what the sand still says at night. Because when you strip away the statues and the doctrines, you're left with something older than religion, reverence. And in that reverence, a whisper. There were gods before the gods, you know, and some of them still remember you. The wind kicks softly through the ruins, now warm and dry, like a breath that's traveled a long way to meet you. You're still in Egypt, yes, but this final leg of your journey is different. You're not looking for statues or gods, pyramids, or alignments. You're here for a message, a puzzle, a mystery etched into stone that no one's been able to solve. Because tonight, we close our walk through ancient Egypt with a glance at the Rosicrucian connection, a modern thread that tugs on ancient roots, and what it might reveal about a knowledge long hidden in plain sight. Now, if you've ever heard of the Rosicrucians, you probably associate them with Europe's secret societies, alchemical texts, and mysterious manifestos in the 1600s. But the origins of their symbolism, and possibly their inspiration, reach much farther back. To Egypt, to Hermes Trismegistus, to the land of Chem. Let's take it step by step. The Rosicrucian order, as we know it, burst onto the scene with a series of anonymous publications in the early 17th century, the Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. These texts claim the existence of a secret brotherhood of enlightened thinkers devoted to truth healing and the transformation of both self and society. But within the pages of those books lies a recurring theme: Egyptian wisdom. The Rosicrucians saw themselves not as inventors of new truths, but as guardians of ancient ones. Truths preserved, encoded, and handed down through generations. Truths said to originate in the mystery schools of ancient Egypt. This isn't just a literary device, it's a lineage. You've probably heard of the Hermetic tradition, that enigmatic blend of mysticism, astrology, alchemy, and spiritual philosophy, attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes wasn't just the Greek god of wisdom. He was a fusion, a blend of Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, scribe of the gods, master of writing, keeper of divine knowledge. The Emerald Tablet, a cornerstone of Hermetic thought, is attributed to him. You've likely heard its most famous line, "As above, so below." Sound familiar? The same cosmic mirroring found in Egyptian temple design, pyramid alignment, and celestial correspondence. But here's where it gets interesting. The Hermetic texts, including the Corpus Hermeticum, were not written in ancient Egypt. They were compiled centuries later, likely in Hellenistic Alexandria. Yet their content points back again and again to an older source. The temples, the initiations, the sacred knowledge once whispered in stone halls deep beneath Luxor, Edfu, and Abydos. So, the Rosicrucians, drawing on Hermeticism, believed they were reconnecting with a stream of knowledge that had survived Atlantis, been preserved in Egypt, hidden in symbols, and eventually passed to Europe through alchemists, scholars, and mystics. You pause now in a quiet Cairo courtyard where the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, yes, it exists, is styled like an ancient temple. Inside, the exhibits don't just focus on artifacts, they focus on ideas, on energy, on initiation. According to Rosicrucian teachings, the temples of ancient Egypt weren't just for worship, they were for transformation. Places where initiates underwent trials of darkness, silence, light, and revelation. You begin to understand they saw Egypt not as a past civilization, but as a blueprint for awakening. Think about the symbolism. The pyramid pointing upward representing spiritual ascent. The Ankh symbol of life, not just existence, but eternal life. The Eye of Horus watching not just outward, but inward. Rosicrucians claimed this wasn't metaphor, it was metascience. Spiritual technology. Practices encoded in story and stone, not to be worshipped but replicated within oneself. Even the process of mummification to them wasn't merely about preserving bodies. It was about the soul's journey, the shedding of layers, the symbolic death before spiritual rebirth. Historians still argue whether these modern esoteric groups have any real connection to ancient Egypt. The timelines are murky, the documentation is thin. But something strange happens when you compare the symbols. The rose and cross of the Rosicrucians mirrors the lotus and ankh in Egyptian art. Both are symbols of blooming life overlaid upon a structure of order. Their fascination with sacred geometry, also found in the floor plans of temples like Dendera and Karnak. Even the ritual robes used in Rosicrucian initiations echo the color codes and regalia of high Egyptian priests. Coincidence or continuity? There's more. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a wave of Freemasons also traced their roots to Egypt, building their entire system of degrees on Egyptian rites. Many even went so far as to found their own branches, like the rite of Memphis Misraim, named directly after Egypt. And where did those rites draw from? Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, the idea that Egypt holds the original key, maybe not in its politics, not even in its rituals, but in its symbolic architecture of the soul. You return to the Great Pyramid now, not physically, but in memory, and you realize it's not a building, it's a process. To the ancient initiates, it represented a journey inward, down the descending passage, into darkness, through chambers, toward light, a symbolic map of death transformation and awakening. The Rosicrucians in their quiet libraries and candlelit meetings weren't trying to recreate Egyptian history. They were trying to remember the inner map encoded within it. And whether you believe them or not, the map remains, etched in temples, carved in stone, reflected in symbols, waiting for someone, maybe you, to trace it, not on a piece of paper, but across your own consciousness. That's why this connection matters. Because Egypt isn't just a place of the past. It's a language once still spoken in symbols, dreams, and mystery schools hidden in plain sight. And when you follow the thread from Rosicrucian manifestos to Hermetic fragments to the carved walls of Abydos, you're not chasing fiction. You're chasing continuity, a lineage of remembering, and in a world that forgets so quickly, that might just be the most radical thing of all. So now, as the journey draws to a close, you sit in stillness. The desert sleeps, the stars blink, the stone temples hum in your memory, and you realize the most powerful mysteries are not the ones you solve. They're the ones that change you. And now you're still. No more footsteps echoing on ancient flagstones. No more whispers from the statues or questions etched into the stars. Just the hum of night air and the gentle rhythm of your own breath, slowing with each moment. You've traveled through sacred chambers and sun-drenched ruins. You've felt the weight of granite too precise for reason, and listened to myths that feel too familiar to dismiss. You've touched the silence in museum corridors and traced invisible lines that stretch from stone to star heart to cosmos. But more than that, you've listened. Listened to a land that doesn't just tell stories, it remembers them. Egypt is not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be honored. A mirror that reflects not only its own past, but the mysterious shape of your own longing for wonder, for connection, for meaning that endures. Maybe the gods weren't forgotten. Maybe they're just quieter now. Maybe the machines weren't lost, just paused. Maybe the stars don't align by accident. Maybe they're pointing. And maybe you came here not to fall asleep, but to wake up softly, gently to the idea that history is deeper than dates, and that mystery is not a gap in knowledge, but a doorway. So take one more breath. Let it stretch long and low. The desert wind has settled. The sand is still. And the temples dream on even now. You can rest knowing you've walked a path few dare to follow. A path not just across the earth, but through time and memory and something eternal. Good night, traveler. Sleep deep, and may the stars remember you. The wind kicks softly through the ruins, now warm and dry, like a breath that's traveled a long way to meet you. You're still in Egypt, yes, but this final leg of your journey is different. You're not looking for statues or gods' pyramids or alignments. You're here for a message, a puzzle, a mystery etched into stone that no one's been able to solve. Because tonight, we close our walk through ancient Egypt with a glance at the Rosicrucian connection, a modern thread that tugs on ancient roots, and what it might reveal about a knowledge long hidden in plain sight. Now, if you've ever heard of the Rosicrucians, you probably associate them with Europe's secret societies, alchemical texts, and mysterious manifestos in the 1600s. But the origins of their symbolism, and possibly their inspiration, reach much farther back. To Egypt, to Hermes Trismegistus, to the land of Chem. Let's take it step by step. The Rosicrucian order, as we know it, burst onto the scene with a series of anonymous publications In the early 17th century, the Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. These texts claim the existence of a secret brotherhood of enlightened thinkers devoted to truth healing and the transformation of both self and society. But within the pages of those books lies a recurring theme: Egyptian wisdom. The Rosicrucians saw themselves not as inventors of new truths, but as guardians of ancient ones, truths preserved, encoded, and handed down through generations. Truths said to originate in the mystery schools of ancient Egypt. This isn't just a literary device, it's a lineage. You've probably heard of the Hermetic tradition, that enigmatic blend of mysticism, astrology, alchemy, and spiritual philosophy, attributed to a figure called Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes wasn't just the Greek god of wisdom, he was a fusion, a blend of Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, scribe of the gods, master of writing, keeper of divine knowledge. The Emerald Tablet, a cornerstone of Hermetic thought, is attributed to him. You've likely heard its most famous line, "As above, so below." Sound familiar? The same cosmic mirroring found in Egyptian temple design, pyramid alignment, and celestial correspondence. But here's where it gets interesting. The Hermetic texts, including the Corpus Hermeticum, were not written in ancient Egypt. They were compiled centuries later, likely in Hellenistic Alexandria. Yet their content points back again and again to an older source: the temples, the initiations, the sacred knowledge once whispered in stone halls deep beneath Luxor, Edfu, and Abydos. So, the Rosicrucians, drawing on Hermeticism, believed they were reconnecting with a stream of knowledge that had survived Atlantis, been preserved in Egypt, hidden in symbols, and eventually passed to Europe through alchemists, scholars, and mystics. You pause now in a quiet Cairo courtyard where the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, yes, it exists, is styled like an ancient temple. Inside, the exhibits don't just focus on artifacts, they focus on ideas, on energy, on initiation. According to Rosicrucian teachings, the temples of ancient Egypt weren't just for worship, they were for transformation. Places where initiates underwent trials of darkness, silence, light, and revelation. You begin to understand they saw Egypt not as a past civilization, but as a blueprint for awakening. Think about the symbolism: the pyramid pointing upward representing spiritual ascent, the Ankh symbol of life, not just existence, but eternal life, the Eye of Horus watching not just outward, but inward. Rosicrucians claimed this wasn't metaphor, it was metascience. Spiritual technology, practices encoded in story and stone, not to be worshipped but replicated within oneself. Even the process of mummification to them wasn't merely about preserving bodies. It was about the soul's journey, the shedding of layers, the symbolic death before spiritual rebirth. Historians still argue whether these modern esoteric groups have any real connection to ancient Egypt. The timelines are murky, the documentation is thin. But something strange happens when you compare the symbols.